One night, the storm was relentless, battering the windows of our small apartment like it wanted to break through. My husband was away on a work trip, and I just put my 3-year-old daughter to bed. As I sat down to finally relax, I heard a faint knock at the door. It wasn't the kind of knock you'd hear from someone waiting to be let in. It was slower, almost testing, like whoever was on the other side wasn't sure if they wanted to be noticed. My heart stopped. No one should have been out in that storm, much less at my door. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, listening for more sounds. Another knock, louder this time. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay put, I crept towards the peephole. My fingers trembled as I reached for the light switch to see outside. But just as I touched it, the knock came again, impatient now. My mind raced. Could it be a neighbor? Someone in trouble? As I peeked through the peephole, my stomach dropped. The hallway was empty. A chill ran down my spine, colder than any gust of wind outside. I backed away from the door, forcing myself to breathe. Maybe it was a prank, or my imagination. But then I heard it, scratching. It was soft at first, just a faint whisper of sound. But it grew louder, more desperate, like claws raking against wood. The noise wasn't at the door anymore. It was coming from the window behind me. My blood ran cold as I spun around. The storm raged outside, lightning illuminating the room in flashes. But between those flashes, I saw something move. A shadow, just outside the window. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to call anyone, but my hands were shaking too much to dial. My daughter stirred in her room, and I forced myself to move to check on her. As I reached her door, the sound shifted again, now coming from the back door of the apartment. It was as though whatever it was knew I was there and was circling, trying to find a way in. My breathing was shallow as I pushed the door to my daughter's room open. She was still asleep, her tiny body curled up under her blanket, blissfully unaware. I shut her door softly, pressing my ear against it to muffle the sound of my pounding heartbeat. Then silence. Nonax, nos gratis. Just the wind howling outside. I tiptoed back to the living room, hoping, praying that it was over. But the moment I stepped in, the power cut out. The room plunged into darkness. I can't explain the noise I heard next. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was guttural, low, and sent every instinct I had into overdrive. My survival mode kicked in. Grabbing a knife from the kitchen, I positioned myself between the window and my daughter's room, ready to defend her from... what exactly? I didn't know. The scratching began again, louder than before, this time on the front door. It wasn't just scratching, it was pounding, relentless and aggressive. And then, for the first time, I heard a voice. It was a whisper, just loud enough to hear over the storm. Let me in. It was male, deep, and cold, like it had been scraped from the depths of something inhuman. I froze, knife shaking in my hand. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the figure outside the window. This time, it wasn't just a shadow. It was a face, pressed against the glass, grinning with teeth too sharp and eyes too wide. My scream got caught in my throat as I stumbled backward, tripping over the coffee table. My head hit the floor hard, and everything went black. When I came to, the storm had passed. Morning light seeped through the curtains, and everything seemed normal. My daughter was playing with her toys, as if nothing had happened. I wanted to believe it was a nightmare, my imagination playing tricks on me in the dead of night. But when I went to the front door, I found deep claw marks gouged into the wood. And on the window where I'd seen the face, there was a smudge, an outline, where something had pressed its face against the glass. I moved out of that apartment a week later, but sometimes late at night, I still hear that voice echoing in my head. Let me in. Let's start a new story. It started as an ordinary Wednesday evening, the kind where nothing remarkable ever happens. I had just gotten home from my job at a small insurance agency, dragging my usual tote bag full of paperwork I'd promised myself I wouldn't bring home this time. It was early autumn, and the sun was already dipping below the horizon when I pulled into my driveway. My neighborhood was the picture of suburbia. Rows of similar houses, well-maintained lawns, and the occasional flicker of a porch light. Comfortingly dull. I was halfway through making dinner when I realized I'd left my wallet in the car. I remember muttering something under my breath and stepping outside, the air cooler than I'd expected. The street was quiet, just the sound of distant traffic and a faint rustle of leaves. As I reached into the passenger seat, I heard it for the first time, a soft, almost imperceptible whistle. Not a cheerful tune, but more like someone exhaling through pursed lips. I froze, peering into the shadows around me, but the street was empty. A gust of wind tugged at the hem of my sweater, and I shrugged it off, figuring it was just the sound of air through the nearby trees. Back inside, the evening unfolded uneventfully. I ate dinner, watched TV, and settled in a bed with the kind of book you forget as soon as you finish it. Around midnight, I was startled awake by the sound of my dog, Bailey, barking from the living room. She wasn't a big dog, just a scrappy little terrier mix, but her bark was sharp and insistent. Heart pounding, I threw on my robe and went to check. Bailey stood rigid near the front window, her fur bristling. When I looked outside, I didn't see anything unusual at first, just the dim glow of the streetlights. But then I caught a faint movement at the edge of my neighbor's yard. A figure, barely more than a silhouette, stood motionless beneath a tree. They were too far away for me to make out any details, but something about their stance, the way they were perfectly still, like they were holding their breath, made my skin crawl. "Hey!" I called out instinctively, though I immediately regretted it. The figure didn't move. They didn't even flinch. They just stood there. Bailey's barking intensified, and I yanked the curtains shut, trying to convince myself it was just a teenager playing a prank or some harmless passerby. I double-checked the locks before heading back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next few nights, things escalated. At first, it was subtle. A knock at the door with no one there when I answered. My trash bins tipped over in the morning, strange footprints in the dew on my lawn. I told myself it was probably raccoons or neighborhood kids. But then came the notes. The first one was taped to my front door. Just a single word, written in blocky, uneven letters. Watching. My throat went dry as I stared at it, trying to tell myself it had to be a joke. But then I noticed something chilling. There was no tape on the back. The paper felt damp, like it had been licked and stuck to the door. My stomach turned. I threw it away and tried to shake it off, but that night I barely slept. Every creak of the house made me jump, and I kept expecting to see that figure standing outside my window again. A few days later, I found another note, this time on my car windshield. It read, "Door unlocked." I froze. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle, terrified that whoever had left the note was waiting inside. But the car was empty. I locked it, double-checked every door and window in the house, and even bought a cheap security camera to mount above the porch. I told myself I was being paranoid. The camera was a mistake. The first night I set it up, nothing happened. I checked the footage the next morning and felt a wave of relief when it was just hours of nothingness. The second night, though, was different. Around 2:30 a.m., the motion sensor was triggered. I watched the grainy black and white feed on my laptop, my breath catching in my throat as a figure came into view. It was the same person from before, standing in my yard. They were facing the camera, their features obscured by a hood and shadows. But what made my blood run cold was their movement or lack of it. They didn't walk across the yard or approach the house. They simply appeared in the frame, like they had stepped out of the darkness itself. For 3 minutes, they stood perfectly still, staring at the camera. Then, without warning, they turned and walked out of view, disappearing as quickly as they had come. I called the police. They sent an officer who was polite, but visibly skeptical. He took my statement, glanced at the footage, and told me they'd keep an eye on things. That was it. The following night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I sat in the living room with Bailey at my feet, clutching a baseball bat and jumping at every noise. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the security app linked to the camera. Motion detected. My hands were shaking so badly, it took me 3 tries to open the app. When the feed loaded, my stomach lurched. The figure was back, but this time they weren't in the yard. They were on my porch, inches from the door. Their hood was down now, revealing a face that was wrong. The features were too smooth, too symmetrical, like a mannequin brought to life. They tilted their heads slightly, as if listening, and then raised a hand to knock. The sound was deafening, a sharp rap that echoed through the house. I screamed and stumbled backward, dropping the phone. Bailey went wild, barking and snarling at the door. The knocking continued, louder and more insistent, until I thought the wood might splinter. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, but when the sun rose, everything was normal. No sign of the figure, no damage to the door. Even the camera footage was gone, as if it had been erased. I tried to move on, tried to convince myself it was over. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that soft, eerie whistle outside my window. And I know they're still out there, waiting. Let's start a new story. The sun dipped low over the horizon, its amber light spilling across the frost-crusted ground, and I stood on the edge of the park, debating whether or not to go in. This wasn't just any park. It was the place where we used to meet, the spot where years ago, my life had started to shift in ways I hadn't fully understood at the time. The air bit at my face, sharp and clean, the kind of cold that didn't ask for permission to get into your bones. I zipped my coat up higher and started walking, my boots crunching through snow that hadn't been shoveled off the trail yet. The park was mostly empty. A couple of joggers, a guy with his dog tugging at a leash, and me, clutching a steaming cup of coffee from the gas station down the street. I wasn't sure why I'd come back. Well, I knew why, but it was the kind of why you don't want to admit, even to yourself. There was no text, no call, no message telling me to show up. Just the whisper of nostalgia, sneaky and persistent, tugging at me until I caved. The trees around me were stripped bare, their skeletal branches casting shadows on the path. I kept walking, drawn toward the bench by the pond. It looked exactly the same as it had all those years ago, down to the graffiti carved into the wood. I ran my fingers over one of the carvings, an uneven heart with initials I didn't recognize, and sat down, my breath puffing out in quick clouds. For a long time, I just stared at the pond. The surface was frozen solid, reflecting the bruised colors of the evening sky. I thought about the last time I'd been here, how the summer heat had made the air thick and sticky, how laughter had seemed to float across the water like music. It was the kind of memory that felt so vivid, you'd swear you could step into it if you just closed your eyes long enough. But that was the thing about memories. They weren't time machines, no matter how much you wanted them to be. They were just fragments, imperfect and out of reach, teasing you with what could never be again. Long time no see, a voice said behind me, startling me so badly I almost dropped my coffee. I turned and saw her standing there, bundled up in a coat that looked 2 sizes too big, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, and she held a thermos in one hand, the other stuffed deep into her pocket. "Claire," I said, her name slipping out like it belonged to someone else, someone from a lifetime ago. She gave me a small smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I wasn't sure you'd actually show up. So there had been a message then, one I hadn't gotten, or one I'd been pretending not to notice in the lines between conversations we hadn't had in years." I gestured to the bench, and she sat down next to me, leaving a careful gap between us. "Couldn't resist," I said, trying to sound casual, even though my heart was beating like I'd just run a marathon. We sat there for a while, not saying much, just the crunch of snow underfoot as someone walked by, the distant barking of a dog, the faint sound of a car's engine humming on the street. I thought about all the things I could say, apologies, explanations, questions I wasn't sure I wanted answers to. But the words got stuck in my throat, tangled up with the cold and the years that had passed. "So," she said, finally breaking the silence, "still drink your coffee black? Still hate it that way?" I countered, and for the first time, she laughed, a quiet, warm sound that cut through the chill like sunlight. "Some things never change," she said, shaking her head. Then her expression softened, and she looked out at the pond, her eyes distant. "But some things do." It was a simple statement, but it landed heavy, pulling at something deep inside me. I wanted to ask what she meant, if she was talking about herself, or me, or us, or something else entirely. But instead, I just nodded like I understood. "Maybe I did. I think about this place a lot," she said, her voice quieter now. "Not just you. Everything. The way we used to talk about the future, like it was this big, bright thing waiting for us. Like we had it all figured out. Yeah, I said, my throat tight. We were really good at pretending, weren't we? She smiled again, but this time it was sad, the kind of smile that knew too much. You ever wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed? Stay? I echoed. Here? Or with? She cut me off, shaking her head quickly. Never mind. Forget I said anything. But of course, I couldn't forget. It hung there between us, unspoken, but undeniable, like a shadow stretching across the snow. We fell into silence again, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable, but wasn't quite easy either. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between us, to say something that would make sense of the strange mix of longing and regret that had settled in my chest. But all I did was take another sip of coffee, the heat of it barely cutting through the cold. When she stood up, I knew it wasn't because she wanted to leave, but because she had to. There were too many things we couldn't say, too many ghosts sitting on that bench with us. She slung her bag over her shoulder and looked down at me, her eyes searching mine for something I wasn't sure I could give her. Take care of yourself, okay? She said, her voice softer than the wind that ruffled her hair. You too, I said, the words feeling too small for everything I meant. She hesitated, just for a moment, and then she turned and walked away, her footsteps crunching through the snow until they faded into the distance. I sat there for a long time after she left, staring at the pond, watching the sky shift from gold to gray. And for the first time in years, I let myself feel it all. The ache of what was, the weight of what wasn't, and the faint, fragile hope of what still could be. Sometimes you come back to a place not to relive the past, but to remind yourself that you've survived it. And maybe, just maybe, to start something new. Let's start a new story. It started with a spoon, just an ordinary spoon, resting on the counter of my small apartment kitchen. I remembered putting it there after stirring my coffee that morning. When I got home from work, it was still there, exactly where I'd left it, even though I could have sworn I'd put it in the sink before leaving. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I just remembered wrong. The next day, though, it was the mug. My favorite mug, a chipped, yellow one with a fading smiley face. Sat on the table exactly as it had that morning, its handle angled toward me, as if frozen mid-reach. I distinctly remembered rinsing it and putting it on the drying rack before I left for the office. Yet there it was, dry and waiting for me in the same spot I'd seen it earlier. By the third day, it wasn't just objects. On my commute home, I saw a red Honda Civic at an intersection. Nothing unusual about it until I noticed the same car. Same scratches on the bumper, same stuffed panda on the dashboard, 2 blocks down, waiting at another light. And then again, parked outside the convenience store where I stopped to grab milk. I joked to myself that I was being followed by the laziest spy in existence. But a thin thread of unease started to creep in. It didn't stop there. My neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, waved at me from her porch as I left for work, her knitting needles clicking as she nodded toward the brisk morning air. Hours later, as I walked back up the street, she was still there, in the exact same position, the same partially knitted scarf trailing from her lap. The porch light, which was usually off until dusk, was glowing faintly like a low battery trying to stay alive. She didn't respond when I waved back. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about the stillness of my apartment felt suffocating, like the air wasn't circulating properly. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through the weirdness of the last few days. Around 2 a.m., I got up for water. As I passed through the living room, I saw my keys on the coffee table, glinting under the streetlights streaming through the window. The same spot I'd left them when I got home earlier. Except I was certain, absolutely certain, that I'd already grabbed them to put them in my bag for the morning. My chest tightened, and for the first time, I felt a genuine flicker of fear. The days blurred into each other after that. Repeating patterns emerged everywhere I looked. The same jogger in a blue hoodie passed me every morning on my walk to the bus stop, their pace never changing. The same song played on the radio at work at 10:15 a.m. sharp, no matter what station I tuned to. My phone started acting up too. Messages I swore I'd sent weren't in my history. Photos I didn't remember taking appeared in my gallery. A sunset I hadn't seen, a stray dog I didn't recognize, staring straight into the lens. The turning point came one Friday night. I've been trying to shake the strange feeling that had been clinging to me all week. A friend invited me to a bar downtown, and I jumped at the chance to escape my spiraling thoughts. The drinks were strong, the music was loud, and for the first time in days, I felt a bit more like myself. Then, as I was scanning the crowd, I saw someone who looked just like me. Same haircut, same leather jacket, even the same nervous tapping of fingers on the rim of a glass. I froze, my drink halfway to my lips. She locked eyes with me for the briefest moment, then turned and disappeared into the crowd. I stumbled home in a daze, the alcohol doing little to dull the sharp edges of my confusion. As I reached my apartment door, I noticed something strange. My doormat, which usually said "Home Sweet Home," now read "Welcome Back." My stomach churned. I didn't even own a doormat like that. Inside, the air felt wrong again. Heavy, stagnant. My keys were on the table, where I'd sworn I'd left them before going out, but my bag was already hanging on the chair, as though I'd never taken it with me. The spoon was back on the counter. My mug was on the table, its handle facing me like a familiar taunt. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, and noticed my reflection in the window. Except it wasn't moving. I stood still, staring at it, and it stared back, head tilted slightly as though studying me. That's when it hit me. The patterns weren't random. They weren't coincidences or tricks of my tired mind. They were deliberate, like the world around me was a stage, resetting itself each time I looked away. And I was the only one who seemed to notice. I started testing it, placing objects in specific ways and checking if they'd move. Walking different routes to see if the red Honda would appear again. Every time, the result was the same. The world seemed to adjust itself, subtly nudging me back into familiar routines. Even my phone calls felt scripted. Friends responded with phrases I could almost predict, their voices flat and distant, like bad actors struggling to hit their marks. One night, as I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my unmoving reflection in the darkened window, I whispered, "Who's doing this?" The reflection smiled. I didn't. I don't know why I didn't scream or run or smash the glass. Something about that moment felt too big, too impossible to fight against. Instead, I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. The reflection mouthed back, but no sound came. I couldn't make out the words, but the look in its eyes, my eyes, was almost pitying, as if it knew I wouldn't understand even if it explained. Now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Not just by people, but by the world itself. It's in the way the sun rises at the same angle every morning, the way my neighbor's scarf never grows longer, the way my keys always return to the same spot no matter where I leave them, the way my reflection sometimes lingers a second too long before following my movements. I don't know if it's a program, a dream, or some elaborate prison I can't escape. But the worst part isn't the not knowing. It's the creeping realization that even if I could figure it out, it might not change anything. Whether I'm the observer or the observed, what difference does it make when the outcome is the same? Some nights, I catch myself smiling back at the reflection. I don't know who's in control anymore. Maybe it doesn't matter. Let's start a new story. It started with the socks, an innocuous enough thing. My navy blue socks were missing when I was getting dressed for work. I distinctly remembered placing them on the armrest of the couch the night before. I live alone, no pets, and I hadn't had anyone over in weeks. Yet, when I went to retrieve them, they were gone. I searched the usual places, laundry basket, under the couch, even the fridge for some inexplicable reason, but nothing. Frustrated but running late, I grabbed a mismatched pair and headed out the door. The day progressed normally at first. My commute was the same 45-minute slog through the morning gridlock, punctuated by a podcast about unsolved mysteries. I filed reports, answered emails, and exchanged the usual small talk with coworkers. But then, at around 2:15 p.m., I noticed my boss, Meredith, walking briskly past my desk. She wasn't wearing her usual tailored blazer. Instead, she had on a garish red cardigan that clashed horribly with her patterned skirt. It struck me as odd because Meredith was notoriously meticulous about her appearance. Then, not 5 minutes later, she passed by again, this time in her signature blazer, carrying the same stack of papers. I froze. It wasn't just a fleeting sense of déjà vu. It was the exact same moment replaying itself, but with one small change. I waited to see if anyone else would react, but the office hummed along as if nothing had happened. I even tried asking Steve, the guy at the desk next to mine, "Hey, did you notice Meredith just walked by twice?" He shrugged without looking up. "Probably just forgot something," he said, as if that explained everything. That night, I chalked it up to stress or an overactive imagination. But when I got home, the socks were back on the armrest, folded neatly as if they'd never been missing. I stared at them for a long time, half expecting them to vanish again if I looked away. They didn't, but I couldn't shake the unease settling into my chest. The next morning, the world felt off. The air seemed heavier, the colors slightly duller, like everything had been dimmed a fraction. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed the neighbor's cat lounging on my windowsill. It wasn't unusual for the cat to hang around, but something about it felt wrong. Its fur seemed to shimmer, like static on an old TV, and when it turned its head toward me, its eyes weren't cat eyes. They were human, staring directly into mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I dropped my mug and it shattered on the floor. When I glanced back up, the cat was gone. I rushed to the window, flung it open, and looked outside, but there was no trace of it. For a moment, I wondered if I was losing my mind. Then came the loops. The first one happened that afternoon. I was sitting in my car at a red light, drumming my fingers on the steering wheel to the beat of a song on the radio. A woman in a bright yellow raincoat crossed the street in front of me, holding a child's hand. The light turned green, and I drove off. But a block later, I reached another light, and the same woman, the same raincoat, the same child crossed in front of me. I slammed on the brakes, causing the car behind me to honk angrily. The radio continued playing as if nothing was amiss, but I was too stunned to move. I watched the woman cross, turn the corner, and disappear. Heart pounding, I took a different route home, certain I'd escaped whatever bizarre repetition I'd just experienced. But when I reached my apartment door, I found myself gripping the handle in a surreal moment of déjà vu. I could swear I'd already done this, walked up these stairs, opened this door, stepped into this exact moment before. Inside, everything looked normal at first, but then I noticed the socks on the armrest again. This time, they weren't navy blue. They were bright red, a pair I didn't even own. I stared at them, willing myself to remember if I'd bought them and forgotten. My head buzzed with static as I reached out to touch them, half expecting them to dissolve under my fingers. They didn't. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would reset whatever part of my brain was malfunctioning. But when I woke up, the loops had tightened their grip on my life. I started seeing the same conversations play out twice in the same day. A barista at the coffee shop spilled my drink, apologized profusely, and offered a replacement, only for the exact same thing to happen an hour later when I returned for an afternoon pick-me-up. At work, Steve told me the same joke 3 times in one day, each time with the same punchline, delivered in the same cadence. By the 3rd time, I interrupted him, finishing the joke for him. He looked at me blankly. "I haven't told you that one before," he said, genuinely puzzled. By the end of the week, I stopped trying to rationalize it. My world had turned into a cracked mirror, and the fractures were growing. Objects in my apartment began subtly rearranging themselves. Books shifted on the shelf. Chairs faced different directions. Even the time on the microwave seemed to flicker inconsistently. I started marking things with sticky notes, hoping to catch whatever was messing with my reality, but the notes would disappear, replaced by others I hadn't written. One morning, I found a note stuck to my bathroom mirror in handwriting that wasn't mine. It read, "Don't trust the cat." I didn't own a cat. The final straw came last night. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a faint hum. It grew louder, vibrating through the walls, through my chest, until it felt like the whole room was pulsing with it. Then all at once it stopped. I sat up, gasping for air, and found myself no longer in my bedroom. I was back in my car, sitting at the same red light, watching the woman in the yellow raincoat cross the street again. This time, she stopped in the middle of the intersection, turned to face me, and pointed directly at me. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. The light turned green. The car behind me honked. I didn't move. I'm still here now, at the intersection, waiting for something to make sense. Let's start a new story. One evening. It was still there, same black box with the little red flag, but the paint had peeled in a way I didn't recognize, like an old wound splitting open. I'd repainted it just last spring. My name wasn't on it anymore either. Instead, the words property of 462 Willow had been stenciled in blocky, faded letters. But I lived at 462 Willow. I was sure of it. I brushed it off as a prank. Kids, maybe. I didn't even mention it to my wife, Claire, when I got inside. She was in the kitchen, her back to me, stirring something in a pot. She didn't look up as I said hello, just kept stirring, her movements slow and mechanical. Her hair, usually tied back, hung loose over her shoulders, darker than usual, almost black. Hey, I tried again, louder this time. Her head twitched slightly in my direction, but she didn't turn around. Something about her was off. The set of her shoulders, the angle of her head. Then she spoke, her voice flat and unfamiliar, like a bad impression of herself. Dinner's almost ready. I froze. It wasn't just her tone. It was the phrasing. Claire never said dinner's almost ready. She'd say, food'll be up in a sec, or something casual like that. I laughed nervously, trying to shake it off, but when I stepped closer, she finally turned around, and I swear to God, it was like looking at a stranger wearing her face. Her eyes were slightly too wide, her smile too tight. Everything okay? She asked. Her tone was light, but the words felt like they were coming from somewhere deep beneath the surface, as though someone else was speaking through her. I stared at her for a long moment, then shook my head and muttered something about a long day at work before heading upstairs to shower. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was overtired. But then the next morning, I noticed the oak tree in our front yard. It was smaller, not just pruned or trimmed. It was visibly younger, the trunk slimmer, the bark smoother. Claire didn't seem to notice when she left for work, kissing me goodbye with that same too tight smile. At work, it was even worse. My desk was the same, my coffee mug, my chair, but the computer keyboard was different. The keys were slightly spaced out, the letters worn in places they hadn't been before. When I asked my coworker Ben about it, he just shrugged. Looks the same as always, he said, but his voice carried an edge of irritation, like I'd been pestering him for weeks instead of asking a single, innocent question. By the end of the week, everything felt wrong. My phone ringtone had changed to a song I'd never heard before, and none of my photos looked quite right. Claire's hair was definitely darker now. No one but me seemed to notice the shift. She was quieter too, her movements slower, almost deliberate. One night, I woke up to find her sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. I called her name, and she turned to me, smiling that awful smile. "Go back to sleep," she said softly. I don't remember falling asleep after that. I tried to call my mom. The line rang, but when someone picked up, it wasn't her voice. It was a woman, close but not her. She spoke like she knew me, even told me stories about my childhood, but the details were just a little wrong. "Don't you remember?" she asked when I hesitated. Her voice was syrupy and warm, but it set my teeth on edge. When I checked the family photos on my phone again, her face wasn't quite the same. It was her, but it wasn't. There was something sharper about her chin, something unfamiliar in her eyes. The more I looked at the photos, the more I realized everyone looked a little off, subtly, insidiously different. By the time the weekend rolled around, I couldn't take it anymore. I confronted Claire. She was in the living room, knitting, a hobby she'd picked up years ago, but never stuck with. I didn't even think to question why she'd suddenly started again. "Claire," I said, "something's going on. You've been acting weird. Everyone's been acting weird." My voice cracked on the last word, and she looked up at me, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" she asked, tilting her head like a bird. "This," I shouted, gesturing wildly. "Everything. The mailbox, the tree, you're not you." Her expression shifted then, her face softening into something almost pitying. "Honey," she said, standing and walking toward me. "You're not making sense." She put her hand on my cheek, and it was ice cold. I pulled away, stumbling back a few steps, but she didn't react. Just kept watching me, her face blank and calm. The next day, I went to my neighbor, Mr. Hart, who'd lived next door since I was a kid. He'd always been friendly, always ready to chat. But when I knocked on his door, a woman I didn't recognize answered. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice clipped. "Is Mr. Hart home?" I stammered, her brow furrowed. "There's no Mr. Hart here. I've lived here for 10 years. I blinked, my stomach lurching. "That's not possible," I whispered, but she was already closing the door. That night, I dreamed of Claire standing at the foot of our bed, her face blank, her eyes black pits. When I woke up, I was alone, and the bed sheets smelled faintly of earth. I turned on the light and saw faint smudges of dirt on the floor leading out of the bedroom. I don't know what's happening. Every day, something changes, something small but undeniable. A crack in the wall that wasn't there before. A coworker who swears we've never met. Yesterday, I passed by a mirror and didn't recognize the reflection staring back at me. I've stopped trying to talk to people. They don't listen. Or maybe they can't. Maybe I'm the one who doesn't belong here anymore. Maybe I've slipped into some other version of my life, where everything is almost the same, but fundamentally horribly wrong. Claire still looks at me with that too tight smile. Sometimes I catch her watching me when she thinks I'm not looking. Sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I feel the weight of her body next to mine, but her breathing is too slow, too even, like she's waiting. I don't think I'll ever get back to where I was. And I don't think she's really Claire anymore. Or maybe she never was. Let's start a new story. When I moved into my new apartment, I wasn't expecting much. It was one of those older complexes on the edge of town, the kind with peeling paint and neighbors who either kept to themselves or yelled at their TVs loud enough for everyone to hear. The price was right, though, and the view of the woods behind the building was oddly calming. I told myself it was a fresh start. The first night, everything seemed normal. I unpacked until exhaustion kicked in, then collapsed in a bed surrounded by boxes. The faint hum of crickets outside lulled me to sleep. Around 3 a.m., I woke up, thirsty and disoriented, but as I made my way to the kitchen, I heard a faint tapping. It wasn't coming from the walls or the ceiling. It sounded like it was coming from the sliding glass door that led to the balcony. My heart rate spiked, but when I peeked out through the curtain, there was nothing there but shadows. I chalked it up to an overactive imagination and went back to bed. The tapping didn't return, but that didn't stop me from dreaming about it. Slow, deliberate knocks like someone testing the glass. The next day, I didn't think much of it. I ran errands, introduced myself to the landlord, and learned that most of the other units were either vacant or rented by long-term tenants who weren't very sociable. The guy directly below me was a retired mechanic named Dale, and the woman next door was a nurse who worked night shifts. Perfect, I thought. Plenty of solitude. That evening, I sat on the couch with a beer, scrolling mindlessly through my phone when I heard the tapping again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. My stomach dropped. I crept toward the balcony door, phone flashlight in hand, and yanked the curtain aside. The glass was fogged up from the cold night air, but there was something written there, scrawled into the condensation. "Hello." I froze. My first instinct was to lock the door and call the police, but as I stood there, the rational part of my brain kicked in. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe kids from one of the neighboring units had climbed up. But I was on the 3rd floor, and there weren't any ledges or fire escapes to make that easy. Shoving the thought away, I grabbed a paper towel, wiped the glass clean, and locked up for the night. The next few days passed uneventfully. I started to believe I'd imagined it, or maybe overreacted. But then, on Friday night, the tapping returned. This time, I ignored it, willing myself to focus on the TV, but after a few minutes, it stopped and was replaced by a faint scraping sound. Against my better judgment, I approached the door again. There was no fog this time, no writing, but there was something small sitting on the balcony floor. I unlocked the door, slid it open, and stepped out into the chilly air. It was a little bundle, wrapped in faded cloth and tied with twine. My hands trembled as I unwrapped it. Inside was a small, rusted key and a note that simply read, "Do you remember?" I didn't know what to do. My mind raced for an explanation, but nothing made sense. I hadn't been in this town long enough to make enemies, much less anyone who'd pull such an elaborate stunt. I told myself I wouldn't give in to fear, so I locked the key and the note in a drawer and went to bed, determined to ignore whatever was happening. By Sunday, the tension had subsided. No tapping, no bundles, no strange notes. I even began to feel a little ridiculous for being so jumpy. That night, though, something woke me, a sound I couldn't place at first. It was like breathing, soft and rhythmic, but it wasn't coming from inside my apartment. My skin prickled as I realized it was coming from above. I didn't have an upstairs neighbor. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight and shined it toward the ceiling. The sound stopped. Heart pounding, I went to the balcony and peered upward. The faint glow of my flashlight barely illuminated the overhang, but for just a moment, I swore I saw movement, a hand withdrawing into the shadows. The next day, I filed a report with the landlord. He seemed unimpressed, muttering something about squirrels in the attic. I asked if I could access the roof to check, but he waved me off, saying it wasn't safe. Frustrated, I took matters into my own hands. That evening, I borrowed a ladder from Dale and climbed up, ignoring my fear of heights. The roof was empty. No footprints, no signs of an intruder. But near the edge, I found another bundle. Inside was a Polaroid photograph, yellowed with age. It was a picture of a house I recognized. It was my childhood home, the one we'd moved out of when I was 10. My hands shook as I flipped it over. On the back, in the same scrawled handwriting as the first note, were the words, "You promised." That night, I called my mom. I didn't tell her everything, just enough to ask if anything strange had happened when we lived in that house. She was quiet for a long moment before sighing. "You were too young to remember," she said. "But when you were little, you had an imaginary friend. You'd talk to him for hours, and sometimes things would happen. Doors would lock on their own. Lights would flicker. I thought it was a phase, but then one day, you told me you didn't want to play with him anymore. You said he got angry. We moved soon after." The conversation left me reeling. I tried to connect the dots, but the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. If this was some kind of spirit, or whatever you want to call it, how could it have followed me here? Why now? And why did it seem to want something from me? The final straw came 2 nights later. I woke up to find a rusted key from the bundle lying on my pillow. The drawer I'd locked it in was open, the note missing. I packed a bag and left that night, crashing on a friend's couch while I figured out my next steps. When I returned a few days later to collect the rest of my things, I found the apartment empty. Not just empty of my belongings, but stripped bare, walls, carpet, appliances, everything. It was as if no one had lived there in years. The landlord's office was boarded up, his phone disconnected. I still don't have answers. All I know is sometimes at night I wake up to the sound of tapping, and I don't open the curtains anymore. Let's start a new story. They were cold, calculating, and fixed just a little too intently on me, even as his mouth curved into what should have been a friendly expression. The encounter started innocuously enough, a late-night grocery run because I'd run out of coffee and couldn't bear the thought of waking up without it. The 24-hour market was a short walk from my apartment, and I made it a habit to go late to avoid crowds. That night, the aisles were nearly deserted except for a bored-looking cashier and one other customer. I noticed him immediately. He wasn't doing anything outright strange, just lingering. He stood near the entrance, pretending to browse the discount rack, but his eyes kept darting to me, peeking out from under the brim of a baseball cap. Something about his stance set me on edge, too casual, too deliberate. But I brushed it off as paranoia. A lot of people get awkward in public. I grabbed my coffee, a pack of granola bars, and a carton of milk, then headed to the self-checkout. That's when he moved. I heard footsteps falling into rhythm with mine as I walked to the machines. My pulse quickened, but I told myself not to be ridiculous. I scanned my items and glanced over my shoulder. He was hovering by the exit now, empty-handed. My stomach churned as I saw him glance at his watch, then back at me. He wasn't shopping. He was waiting. I tried to act normal, taking my time bagging my groceries, hoping he'd leave, but when I finished, he was still there. I thought about asking the cashier to walk me out, but I felt silly. What could I say? A guy standing near the door makes me nervous. I shook it off, muttered a quiet, "You're overreacting," to myself, and headed for the exit. The air outside was sharp and cold, and the parking lot was almost empty. I was halfway across the lot when I heard the sound of heavy footsteps behind me. Not just footsteps, but the deliberate kind, like someone trying to close the gap without running. My fight-or-flight instincts kicked in hard. I spun around so fast, I nearly dropped my bag. He was there, just a few feet away, his hands shoved into his hoodie pockets, that same unsettling smile plastered on his face. "You forgot something," he said, holding out a single granola bar, the same brand I had just bought. Except I knew I hadn't forgotten anything. I had everything in my bag, and there was no way he could have gotten to my groceries without me seeing. My throat went dry. "That's not mine," I managed to say, stepping back. "Are you sure? I saw you drop it." His voice was friendly, almost playful, but it didn't match the way his body angled toward me, blocking my path. I shook my head and tried to step around him, but he shifted to block me again. My heart was hammering now. Every instinct was screaming at me to get away, but I didn't want to antagonize him. I forced a tight smile. "Thanks, but I'm good," I said, and took another step back, trying to keep a calm exterior even as my legs felt like jelly. His smile faltered just for a second, and his eyes narrowed. "You're jumpy," he said, his tone dropping a notch. "You should relax." I didn't respond. My apartment was only a block away, but I couldn't let him follow me there. I decided to head for the nearby gas station instead, well lit with security cameras and people. As casually as I could, I adjusted my path, walking toward the gas station. My hands were clammy around the straps of my bag. He followed. The gas station felt like a beacon of safety in the darkness, but it also felt miles away. Every step felt like a small eternity, and I could hear his footsteps shadowing mine. I glanced back and saw him still clutching the granola bar, his face obscured under the brim of his cap. He wasn't smiling anymore. When I reached the gas station, I all but burst through the door. The attendant, a tired-looking guy in his 40s, glanced up in surprise. I forced a smile and pretended to browse the snacks, keeping one eye on the door. A few seconds later, the man walked in. He didn't look at the shelves or the counter. He looked at me. I moved closer to the counter, gripping a random candy bar as an excuse to stay near the attendant. The man lingered by the door, pretending to browse again, his body angled toward me. The attendant must have sensed something was off because he spoke up. "Everything okay here?" His voice was sharp, and it startled me. The man by the door froze, then smiled again, holding up the granola bar like it was some kind of peace offering. "Just returning something she dropped," he said, his voice smooth and unbothered. I said it wasn't mine. I snapped, my voice shaking. I hadn't meant to say anything, but the fear was bubbling over now. The attendant gave the man a hard look and gestured to the door. "You need to leave." For a moment, I thought he was going to argue. His smile faltered again, and his hand twitched toward his pocket. My breath caught in my throat, but then he turned and walked out without another word. The attendant watched him go, then turned back to me. "You know that guy?" I shook my head, trying to steady my breathing. He followed me from the grocery store. The attendant nodded grimly and picked up the phone. "I'm calling the cops. You stay here." I stayed until the police arrived, but by then, the man was long gone. They took my statement and walked me home, promising to patrol the area. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every shadow outside my window sent my heart racing. A week later, I found a granola bar on my doorstep. It was the same brand, the same flavor, and I knew exactly who had left it. Let's start a new story. I moved into the house on Willow Street in early October. It was one of those post-divorce decisions you make to feel in control of your life again. A fresh start in a quiet neighborhood. The place was nothing fancy. A modest two-story with a creaky porch, an overgrown yard, and enough peeling paint to keep me busy for weeks. But it was mine, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had room to breathe. The first week was uneventful, apart from the usual unpacking chaos. The neighbors seemed nice enough. A middle-aged couple next door waved as they walked their shaggy dog past my driveway. A few kids rode bikes up and down the street. It was almost painfully ordinary, exactly what I wanted. Then I met her. I was trimming the hedges out front when a soft, lilting voice startled me. "You must be new here." I turned to see a woman standing on the sidewalk, maybe in her late 30s, with wavy dark hair that framed her pale face. Her smile was wide and unnervingly still, like someone who'd practiced in the mirror too long. She held out a plate covered with foil. "I'm Angela. Thought I'd welcome you with some homemade cookies." I hesitated, but forced a smile. "Thanks. I'm Mark." I wiped my hand on my jeans before taking the plate. Angela didn't leave right away. She stood there, asking overly familiar questions. What brought me here, where I was from, whether I was married or single. It felt intrusive, but she didn't seem malicious, just overly friendly in that small-town way. Eventually, she waved goodbye and walked down the street, her figure growing smaller, but no less deliberate with each step. I watched her until she disappeared around the corner, and for reasons I couldn't articulate, my stomach felt uneasy. The cookies sat untouched on my counter. The next time I saw Angela, it was at the grocery store a few days later. She seemed genuinely delighted to run into me, pushing her cart as if she'd been waiting there all day. "Mark, what are the odds?" Her voice carried an edge of amusement, as though she knew something I didn't. I mumbled something polite and moved on, but she followed me, commenting on what I was buying. "Oh, you like spicy salsa? Brave choice. And stocking up on canned soup already?" She laughed as if it were a joke between old friends. By the time I reached the checkout line, I was ready to escape, but when I glanced back, Angela was gone. No goodbye, no trace of her cart or groceries. I stood there, my pulse inexplicably racing. That night, I thought I saw someone standing across the street, just beyond the glow of the streetlight. It was probably a trick of my tired eyes, maybe a shadow cast by the branches swaying in the wind. But as I turned off the porch light, I swore I saw movement, a slight shift in the darkness, as if someone had stepped back further into the gloom. The small oddities piled up after that. One morning, I found my trash can tipped over, the lid perfectly balanced upright on the sidewalk. Another day, my garden hose was coiled in a way I never left it, loops unnaturally tight and neat. I brushed it off as neighborhood kids playing pranks. Angela kept appearing. She'd pop up while I was raking leaves or walking to the mailbox, always with that too wide smile and questions that felt a little too personal. Once, she asked if I'd been sleeping well, her head tilted as though studying my reaction. Another time, she mentioned hearing strange noises at night from my direction, though I hadn't noticed anything unusual yet. Then came the night I heard the knocking. It started just after midnight, a soft, rhythmic tap-tap-tap against the back door. I froze in bed, straining to hear. It stopped for a moment, then resumed, louder this time. My heart pounded as I grabbed the baseball, but I kept under my bed and crept downstairs. I flipped on the porch light and yanked the door open, but there was nothing, just the empty yard, bathed in pale light. The next morning, Angela was waiting for me by the mailbox. "Rough night?" she asked, her smile sharper than usual. I wanted to ask if she'd seen or heard anything, but the words died in my throat. Instead, I muttered something vague and retreated inside. The tapping happened again 2 nights later. This time, it came from the front door. I didn't bother opening it, just stood there in the dark, clutching the bat and listening as it grew louder and more insistent. It stopped suddenly, as though whoever or whatever was out there had lost interest. The silence felt heavier than the noise. I decided to check the neighborhood, maybe ask around, but when I mentioned the strange noises to the couple next door, they exchanged a glance and quickly changed the subject. The kids I'd seen riding bikes now avoided my house entirely, cutting wide arcs across the street. Even the mail carrier seemed to hurry past my driveway. Something was off, but I couldn't figure out what. Then I found the photo. It was tucked under my windshield wiper one morning, a black and white Polaroid of my house taken from a high angle, as if someone had climbed a tree or stood on the roof of a nearby building. In the photo, the blinds in my bedroom window were slightly open, and I could make out my own silhouette inside, staring back at whoever had taken it. I called the police. An officer came by, took a report, and assured me they'd look into it. But as he was leaving, he paused on the porch and said, "You might want to be careful with Angela. She's well, just keep an eye out." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. That night, I locked every door and window, double-checked the curtains, and slept with the bat beside me. At 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of my name, whispered so faintly I thought I might have imagined it. But it came again, closer this time, followed by the creak of floorboards just outside my bedroom door. I didn't open the door. I didn't move. I just sat there in the dark, gripping the bat until my hands ached, listening as the whispers faded into silence. In the morning, the front door was wide open, and the plate of cookies Angela had given me weeks ago was sitting on the porch, untouched, but now covered in dirt and something that looked like blood. I don't know what's happening on Willow Street, but I'm not staying to find out. Let's start a new story. It started on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where the sky can't decide whether to storm or just linger in a dull gray haze. I was at my usual cafe downtown, one of those cozy spots with creaky wooden chairs and shelves stuffed with secondhand books. I had a latte in front of me, my laptop open, pretending to work, but mostly people watching. That's when I noticed him. He was sitting by the window, staring outside, but occasionally glancing around the room, his eyes landing on me more than once. I remember feeling a faint prickle of unease, but I brushed it off. People glance around in public places. It's normal. When I packed up to leave, he left too. At first, I thought nothing of it. The cafe is on a busy street with plenty of reasons for anyone to walk in the same direction. But after a few blocks, I caught his reflection in a shop window. He wasn't behind me anymore. He had crossed the street but was keeping pace, his gaze aimed straight ahead as if he didn't see me at all. I told myself I was overthinking it, ducked into a bookstore for a few minutes, and waited. When I came out, he was gone. The next time I saw him was 2 days later, at the grocery store near my apartment. He was in the produce section, inspecting a bunch of bananas. For a moment, I thought it couldn't be him, just someone with a similar build, similar dark jacket. But then he turned slightly, and I saw his face. It was the same man from the cafe, unmistakably. My stomach tightened. It's a small city, I reminded myself, and people shop for groceries. That's all this is. But then it happened again. A week later, I was at the park jogging along the main trail, and there he was sitting on a bench near the fountain, fiddling with his phone. I slowed my pace, unsure if I should turn back or keep going. Before I could decide, he looked up and saw me. His face broke into a polite, almost hesitant smile, like he recognized me, but wasn't sure if I'd recognize him. Against my better judgment, I nodded back and jogged past. My skin prickled the whole way home. That night, I lay in bed replaying the encounters. 3 times, I told myself. 3 times in a week isn't enough to be sure it's not just a coincidence. But the anxiety had already begun to bloom in my chest, tendrils of doubt curling tighter with each passing minute. I double-checked the lock on my front door before going to bed. For a while, I didn't see him. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in my chest eased. Then, one Saturday evening, I met some friends at a bar across town. The place was packed, loud with music and conversation, the air thick with beer and sweat. We were standing by the counter when I saw him. He was sitting at a high-top table, a drink in front of him, his eyes scanning the room. He didn't seem to notice me this time, but that almost made it worse. My heart started pounding as I stared, trying to make sense of it. Why was he here? Was he following me? Or was I just losing it? I didn't say anything to my friends. Instead, I excused myself early, claiming a headache, and took the long way home, making sure I wasn't being followed. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every sound outside seemed amplified. Every shadow stretched too far. The final straw came a few days later. I had been feeling suffocated, trapped in my own growing paranoia, so I decided to take a drive out to a nearby hiking trail. The fresh air and solitude always helped clear my mind. I parked at the trailhead and started up the path, my footsteps crunching on gravel. The woods were quiet, just the occasional bird call or rustle of leaves in the breeze. About a mile in, I rounded a bend, and there he was, sitting on a log, a water bottle in hand, looking as if he'd been waiting for someone. For me. His expression was calm, almost friendly, but I froze. The world seemed to tilt, my breath catching in my throat. He looked up, surprised, maybe by my reaction, maybe by my sudden appearance. and gave a small wave. "Hey," he said. "Fancy seeing you here." My mouth was dry. I managed a stiff nod and kept walking, my legs trembling. I didn't look back, but I felt his eyes on me until the trees swallowed the trail behind me. I didn't finish the hike. I turned around after another quarter mile and jogged back to my car, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The parking lot was empty except for my car and his. I didn't even wait to catch my breath before peeling out onto the highway, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it would break through my ribs. I started seeing him everywhere after that. On the bus, standing in line at the bank, across the street from my apartment. Always close enough for me to notice, but never close enough to confront. He never did anything overtly threatening, never tried to touch me or invade my space. It was just his presence, constant and unnerving. I began to question everything. My own sanity, my ability to read situations. Was I imagining this? Was he really following me? Or was my mind creating patterns where none existed? One night, I finally broke down and told a friend. She listened patiently, her brow furrowed with concern, but her response was measured. "Maybe it's just a coincidence," she said. "A weird, unsettling coincidence." That's what I wanted to believe. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was becoming part of something I couldn't control, some unspoken plan only he knew the rules to. I started taking different routes to work, avoiding my usual hangouts, even staying in on weekends. None of it seemed to matter. He always found me. The last time I saw him was 3 days ago. I was coming out of my building, and he was standing across the street, leaning against a lamppost. He didn't wave this time. He just watched as I hurried to my car, my keys clutched tightly in my fist. I haven't left my apartment since. I don't know who he is. I don't know why he's doing this. And I don't know if I'll ever find out. Maybe it's all in my head, or maybe I'm not the one imagining things. Let's start a new story. I always prided myself on my memory. Names, dates, faces, these things stuck with me. It wasn't a superpower, just a sharpness I liked to lean on. So when I noticed the first inconsistency, I assumed I'd made a mistake. It was a Thursday morning, early enough that the sky still wore that sleepy blue haze, and I was heading to my usual corner coffee shop. The barista, Lucy, greeted me with her usual cheerful, "Hey, Nate," but something was wrong. Her face was familiar, but the hair, the long, bright red ponytail, wasn't. "Did you dye your hair?" I asked without thinking. Lucy tilted her head, confused. "It's always been this color," she said. I laughed it off. "Right, sorry. Guess I'm still waking up." But the whole interaction felt like wearing a shirt that didn't quite fit. It nagged at me for hours, though I told myself it was nothing. Memory wasn't infallible, right? Maybe Lucy had always been a redhead. Maybe I just hadn't noticed. The next day, the glitch was bigger. I came home from work and tossed my keys onto the hook by the door. But when I went to grab them again, the hook was gone. Not empty. Gone. In its place was a small wooden shelf I'd never seen before, holding a potted succulent and a photo frame. The frame held a picture of me standing beside a woman I didn't recognize. She was tall and blonde, smiling like we were old friends, but no one I'd ever met. I stared at it, cold prickles crawling up my neck. I lived alone. I didn't own a photo frame, let alone a picture of me with a stranger. My first thought was that someone had broken in as some kind of bizarre prank, but nothing else in the apartment had been touched. The locks were fine. My keys, when I finally found them on the kitchen counter, were exactly where I'd left them. That night, I barely slept. The changes escalated after that, subtle at first, but undeniable. The stairwell in my apartment building, which I'd climbed 100 times, was suddenly carpeted in green instead of red. A park I jogged through every weekend had sprouted a fountain at its center, the kind of thing I was sure I'd remember. It wasn't just objects or places. People were different too. My coworker Sasha, who I'd known for 3 years, suddenly had a wedding band on her finger. "Since when are you married?" I asked her during lunch. She blinked at me like I'd grown a second head. "I've been married for 6 years, she said, her tone somewhere between bemused and concerned. "You were at the wedding, Nate." I wasn't at her wedding. I didn't even know she was dating anyone. But when I checked my phone that evening, there were pictures, dozens of them, from her wedding day. Me in a suit, grinning beside Sasha and her husband, a stocky man named Greg, who I'd never seen before in my life. It wasn't just the photos. People began recounting conversations we'd supposedly had, plans we'd made, memories I couldn't place. Remember last Christmas when we all went to your mom's cabin? Lucy asked me one morning, sliding my coffee across the counter. Her hair was now dark brown. By the way, I didn't have a mom's cabin. I didn't even have a mom. Not anymore. She passed away when I was 12. But when I checked my phone that afternoon, there were texts from her. Happy little messages asking about my day. Pictures of a rustic cabin buried in snow. Come up next weekend if you can, one read. My hands were shaking when I dropped my phone. Reality started folding in on itself after that. Days became impossible to track. I'd fall asleep in my bed and wake up somewhere else entirely. A hotel room, the back seat of a car, once even on a park bench. My possessions were never where I left them. My phone's contacts list grew bloated with names I didn't recognize. My own face in the mirror began to shift subtly, like an artist tweaking a self-portrait one brushstroke at a time. My hairline was slightly higher, my jaw sharper, my eyes a shade lighter than they'd been before. I started keeping notes, little reminders scrawled on my arm, or a scrap of paper I kept tucked in my pocket. Today, Sasha wore a red scarf. The park fountain wasn't there last week, but the notes never stayed the same. When I looked at them later, they'd change, as if rewritten in my own handwriting. Sasha's scarf was green. The fountain has always been there. I stopped bothering after a while. What was the point? No one else seemed to notice. I could scream about the shifts, the impossibilities, and people would look at me like I was the one breaking reality, not the other way around. The final straw came one evening when I decided to test it. I walked into my apartment and rearranged everything. I flipped the couch on its side, threw all the books off the shelves, and dumped my drawers onto the floor. Then I left. I went for a walk, long enough that I felt the cold air biting through my coat. When I came back, the apartment was spotless. The couch was upright, the books alphabetized, my drawers neatly organized. On the coffee table was a note in my handwriting. Nice try. I sat down, staring at the note for hours, until the light from the window shifted and cast the room in twilight. It wasn't fear I felt anymore. It was resignation, a quiet understanding that I'd lost whatever fight I thought I was waging. This morning, I woke up to find my reflection smiling at me before I even moved. The face in the mirror tilted its head, not matching mine, and said, "You're starting to get it, aren't you?" I nodded. I didn't need to ask what it meant. Somewhere along the line, I'd stopped being a part of the world. Or maybe the world had stopped being a part of me. It didn't matter. I'm not sure what I am now, but I think I've slipped through the cracks, fallen into a space where reality is just another option, malleable and slippery. And the strangest part? I think I like it here. Let's start a new story. Not Hitchcock style, with swarming flocks or ominous crows gathering on power lines. No, these birds were normal, maybe too normal. It was their songs that got to me. Every morning, they perched on the tree outside my apartment window and chirped the same melody, over and over. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but after a few days, I recorded the sound on my phone. The pattern was clear. 3 high notes, 2 low, a pause, and then a sharp trill. It was weirdly hypnotic, almost comforting. But then I realized they sang it even when it rained, even when there were no birds in sight. I should have closed the window. I didn't. The melody started following me. At work, while typing emails, I'd hear it faintly like a tune someone was humming in the next room. On the subway, it floated above the screech of brakes and chatter of passengers. Even in my dreams, it threaded through the background like a whisper I couldn't quite place. I asked a coworker one day if she heard it too. She tilted her head, listening, then laughed. Birdsong in the office? I wish. Are you feeling okay? That should have been my first red flag. The second came a week later, when I stopped recognizing people I was supposed to know. It was subtle at first. My neighbor, Mr. Lane, smiled at me in the hallway, his cheerful "Morning, Anna," echoing the same way it always did. But his face, it wasn't quite right. His nose seemed longer, his eyes a shade lighter. I brushed it off as my imagination, But then my co-worker Jenna came into the office wearing a green scarf she always wore. Except I could have sworn Jenna was blonde, not brunette. And didn't she have a mole on her left cheek? The more I stared, the less sure I was. One day, I bumped into someone on the street, literally shoulder to shoulder. I turned to apologize, but the words caught in my throat. The man looked exactly like my dad. The same heavy-lidded eyes, the same salt and pepper beard. But he wasn't. My dad had been dead for 3 years. The man stared at me for a second too long, like he was trying to place me as well, then walked away without a word. That night, the bird song didn't stop. Even after I shut the window and pulled the curtains, it echoed through the apartment like it was embedded in the walls. I cranked up the volume on my TV, but it only seemed to grow louder. I pressed my hands over my ears and whispered, "Stop, stop, stop," until I was shaking. It didn't stop. The next morning, my alarm didn't go off. I woke to sunlight streaming through the window and my phone blinking with dozens of missed calls and messages. When I checked the time, it said 4:13 p.m. That was impossible. My phone couldn't be that far off. I scrambled to get ready, but when I looked out the window, the streetlights were on. Cars rolled by as if the city was winding down for the night. Then I noticed the birds. They weren't singing. They were staring at me. There were at least 30 of them, perched in the tree and along the power line, all motionless, their small black eyes fixed on my window. My stomach turned to ice. When I opened the curtains wider, they didn't flinch. They just watched. I stood frozen, staring back, until my phone buzzed in my hand. A text. Don't look at them too long. I dropped the phone like it had burned me. The number was blocked. I ran out of my apartment and didn't stop until I reached the park at the end of the block. My lungs burned, and my chest felt tight, but at least the birds weren't there. I sat on a bench and tried to collect myself, but the unease wouldn't go away. That's when I heard it, the bird song again. It was faint, almost buried beneath the rustling leaves, but it was there, persistent and inescapable. My head snapped around, searching for the source, and that's when I saw her. A little girl sat on a swing alone. Her back was to me, but she wasn't moving. Her arms hung limp at her sides, her head tilted slightly as if she were listening to the same song. Something about her felt off, like the people who didn't quite look like themselves. I should have walked away. Instead, I called out, "Are you okay?" She didn't answer. She didn't even turn her head. I walked closer, the crunch of gravel under my feet deafening in the silence. When I was just a few feet away, she started humming. My blood ran cold. It was the bird song. "Who are you?" My voice cracked. Slowly, she turned to face me, and I stumbled back while rising in my throat. Her face, it wasn't a face. It was blank, smooth skin where her eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Her head cocked to the side, as if she were curious, and the humming grew louder, spilling into the air around me. I ran. I don't remember getting home. All I know is that when I did, the apartment felt different. Wrong. The furniture seemed slightly out of place, the shadows on the walls too sharp. My phone was on the coffee table, even though I dropped it in my rush to leave earlier. It buzzed again. Stop asking questions. The humming hasn't stopped since. It's louder now, seeping into my ears no matter what I do. I've checked every room, every drawer, every corner of the apartment, but I can't find where it's coming from. And I keep seeing things in the mirrors, flashes of movement, reflections that don't line up with what I'm doing. Once, I swear I saw the little girl standing behind me, but when I turned, the room was empty. I don't know what's happening. I don't know if I'm losing my mind or if something is trying to break through, try to tell me something. Every time I think I'm imagining it, something else happens. I found feathers on my pillow this morning, black and glossy, but I don't own any birds. The clock on the wall has started ticking backward, and just now, I heard a knock at my door. It wasn't a normal knock. It was the bird song, tapped out in rhythm against the wood. Let's start a new story. It started on a Thursday. I was on my usual commute to work, headphones in, half awake as I shuffled through the subway crowds. That's when I saw her. She was perched on one of those uncomfortable molded plastic seats, staring straight at me. Nothing about her was particularly striking. Just a woman in her late 20s, maybe early 30s, wearing a black coat and scarf. But her eyes, they held this weight like she knew something I didn't. I felt my stomach twist, not in fear, but in that primal way you sense someone looking at you before you turn your head. When the train reached my stop, I hesitated. I didn't know why, but I had this urge to stay on the train, to see where she was going. But work was work, and I stepped off. As I turned back for one last glance, she was gone. Not just out of sight gone. Her seat was empty, and there was no sign of her on the train or platform. That should have been it. A fleeting moment of strangeness. Something to file away as weird but explainable. But things started to unravel the next day. I woke up feeling groggy, like I hadn't slept at all, though my phone showed I'd been out cold for 8 hours. My morning routine passed in a fog, and when I got to the subway platform, I froze. There she was again, leaning against a pillar, eyes locked on me. Same black coat, same scarf, same unblinking stare. This time, I didn't hesitate. I got on the train and sat across from her, pretending to fiddle with my phone. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. The doors opened at the next stop, and a rush of people crowded in. When I looked up again, she was gone. I told myself it was coincidence, or maybe she was just some strange commuter whose path kept crossing mine. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more wrong it felt. Over the weekend, I started noticing little glitches. I'd put my phone down on the coffee table and find it in the kitchen. A song I was listening to on repeat would suddenly skip to the middle, even though I hadn't touched it. And the time, hours would blur together. I'd glance at the clock at 2 p.m., blink, and it'd be 5 p.m., with no memory of what I'd done in between. By Monday, I was on edge. Work was no better. My co-worker, Jenna, kept asking if I was okay, saying I looked spaced out. I wanted to tell her about the woman on the train, the gaps in time, but I didn't want to sound insane. When I left the office, the sunset bathed the city in a deep orange glow, and as I turned the corner toward the subway, there she was again. This time, she wasn't alone. She stood in the middle of the sidewalk, flanked by 2 men who could have been her brothers. Same pale skin, same dark clothes, same piercing stares. They didn't move, even as people brushed past them. My stomach dropped, and I turned on my heel, deciding to take the long way home. I felt their eyes on my back the entire time. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I dreamt of her face. Except in the dreams, her features kept changing. Hair shorter, eyes darker, her mouth twisting into a faint smile that wasn't there before. When I woke up, I swore I heard her voice whispering my name, soft and echoing, like it came from inside my head. By Wednesday, I'd had enough. I worked up the nerve to talk to Jenna about it. She was the closest thing I had to a confidant at the office, and I figured she'd at least humor me. But when I brought it up, her face went blank. "Who?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "You've never mentioned anyone like that." "Yes, I have," I insisted. "I told you yesterday, remember? About the woman on the train?" Jenna shook her head, looking genuinely concerned. "You didn't talk to me at all yesterday. You barely said 2 words. I thought you were just stressed out or something." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew I'd told her. I could remember every detail of our conversation. Her leaning on the edge of my desk, the way she nodded as I described the woman. But it was like the memory had been wiped from her mind. After work, I decided to avoid the subway entirely. I walked home, zigzagging through busy streets, desperate to shake the feeling that I was being watched. But it didn't help. Every reflective surface, shop windows, puddles, car mirrors, seemed to flicker with movement just as I turned away. I could have sworn I saw her face in a window's reflection, only for it to vanish when I spun around. That night, I started going through old photos, looking for something, anything, that would ground me, remind me I wasn't losing my mind. But as I scrolled through my phone, a chill ran down my spine. There were photos I didn't remember taking. Shots of the subway, dimly lit tunnels, blurry images of a figure in a black coat. One photo made my breath catch in my throat. It was a close-up of her face. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, staring directly at the camera. The file info said the photo had been taken 2 days ago, at a time I should have been at work. The days that followed are harder to piece together. My memories feel fractured, like someone's taken a pair of scissors and snipped away random chunks. I know I saw her again because I remember her voice, soft, almost kind, but with an undercurrent of something cold. "You're not where you think you are," she said, her words echoing in my mind long after she vanished. "You never were." I don't know what she meant, but I feel it now, deep in my bones. My world doesn't feel solid. Time slips through my fingers. Places I know like the back of my hand seem subtly wrong, like someone rearranged the furniture of reality while I wasn't looking. The last time I saw her, I wasn't on the subway or the street. I was at home, sitting in my living room, staring blankly at the TV. One second I was alone, and the next she was there, sitting on the couch like she'd always been there. Her face was calm, almost serene. "It's easier if you stop fighting it," she said. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask her what she meant, but no sound came out. My body wouldn't move. It felt like I was sinking, like the room was folding in on itself, collapsing into something infinite and unknowable. The last thing I remember is her smile, soft and knowing, before everything went black. Now, I'm not sure what's real. The people around me feel like shadows of themselves, their movements too smooth, their voices slightly off. Sometimes, I catch glimpses of her in the periphery of my vision, always just out of reach. I think I'm part of it now, whatever it is. Reality feels like a thin veneer, and beneath it, something vast and incomprehensible is watching and waiting. Let's start a new story. The street lamp outside the diner flickered as I leaned against the counter, swirling the dregs of my coffee in the mud. It was the kind of night that felt stretched thin, like the universe was holding its breath. The neon sign in the window buzzed faintly, casting the word "open" onto the snowbank outside, its glow soft and warped. It was almost midnight, and the place was mostly empty, just me and a guy in the corner booth nursing a plate of fries. The waitress behind the counter, her name tag tilted slightly, read Ruthie, though I doubted that was her real name. She'd been watching me in that way people do when they're trying to decide if you're a story worth telling later. I wasn't, at least not tonight. I was halfway through counting the tiles on the ceiling when the door swung open, the tiny bell above it jangling like a warning. A man stepped in, shaking snow off his coat and stomping his boots on the mat. His face was sharp and weathered, the kind that looked like it had seen things, maybe too much. He glanced around, his eyes brushing over me before locking onto Ruthie. "Coffee," he said, his voice low and gravelly, like it was pulled straight from an old noir film. Ruthie poured him a cup, sliding it across the counter without a word. He sat a few stools down from me, close enough that I could feel the weight of his presence, but far enough to keep things impersonal. He didn't take off his coat. "Long night?" I asked before I could stop myself. I don't know why. Something about the air around him felt charged, like he carried a storm in his pocket. He didn't look at me, just stared into his coffee like it might give him answers. "Aren't they all?" I let out a soft laugh, more out of reflex than amusement. "Fair enough." Ruthie glanced between us, her expression carefully neutral, like she was cataloging the moment but didn't want to be part of it. The guy in the corner booth shifted in his seat, his fries long abandoned. The diner felt like a stage, and we were the only actors left. "You from around here?" I asked, trying again. Maybe it was the loneliness creeping in, the kind that grows louder when the world outside gets quieter. He finally looked at me then, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Used to be." I nodded, not sure what to say to that. There was something final in the way he said it, like whatever tied him to this place had been severed a long time ago. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the snow fell heavy and silent, the kind of snowfall that muffles the world. He looked like he was waiting for something or someone, but I couldn't tell if he expected them to show up or stay away. "You know," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence like a crack of thunder, "some places never let you go." I tilted my head, intrigued despite myself. "What do you mean?" He set the mug down, the ceramic making a dull thunk against the counter. "Doesn't matter how far you run. Some places they stick, like shadows, like echoes." He paused, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the counter. "And sometimes you come back thinking you're going to face it, but all you find is that it's been waiting for you." just sitting there, patient as death. Ruthie froze mid-wipe, her eyes flicking to him, then back to the counter like she was trying to become invisible. The guy in the corner booth stopped pretending to scroll through his phone. "What did you leave behind?" I asked, my voice quieter now. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object, setting it carefully on the counter. It was a brass key, old and tarnished, the kind you'd expect to see in an antique shop. Something about it looked heavier than it should have, like it carried more than just metal. "Everything," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. I stared at the key, my mind racing with possibilities. A house? A storage locker? A metaphor? I wanted to ask, but the look on his face stopped me. It wasn't the look of someone holding onto a keepsake. It was the look of someone haunted by it. The door opened again, and a gust of cold wind swept through the diner, making the bell jingle furiously. A woman walked in, her coat wrapped tightly around her, her eyes scanning the room like she was searching for something or someone. When her gaze landed on the man, her shoulders tensed. She didn't move toward him, just stood there in the doorway, the snow melting off her boots and pooling onto the tile. "You found it," she said, her voice a mix of relief and something heavier. He nodded but didn't say anything. His hand hovered near the key, like he was deciding whether to pick it up or push it away. The air between them was electric, thick with words unsaid and histories untold. Ruthie glanced at me, her eyebrows raised slightly, as if to say, "Are you seeing this?" The woman took a hesitant step forward. "Is it?" "It's yours," he interrupted, his tone flat, but not unkind. He slid the key across the counter toward her, and for a moment, I thought she wouldn't take it. But then she did. Her fingers closed around it, and something shifted in her expression, a mix of sorrow and gratitude, like she'd just been handed a burden and a gift all at once. "Thank you," she said softly, and then she turned and walked out the door without another word. The bell jingled, the door slammed shut, and she was gone. The man stayed seated, his shoulders slumping as if the act of giving the key away had drained him. For the first time, he looked lighter, though. Not happy, exactly, but less weighed down. "Everything okay?" I asked after a long silence. He gave me a tired smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes, but tried anyway. "It will be." And with that, he stood, tossed a few bills onto the counter, and walked out into the snow. I watched him disappear into the night, the storm swallowing him whole. The diner felt emptier after he left, like he'd taken something intangible with him. Ruthie cleared his mug without a word, her movements quick and efficient. But I caught her sneaking one last glance at the door. I sat there for a while, staring at the spot where the key had been. Part of me wanted to follow him, to find out where he'd gone and what the story behind that key was. But some things are better left as mysteries. Eventually, I finished my coffee, left a tip on the counter, and stepped out into the snow. The night was quiet again, the world blanketed in white. I didn't know where the man had gone, or the woman, or what their story really was. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, I'd been a part of it. And maybe in some strange way, it was now a part of me. Let's start a new story. It was one of those sticky summer evenings when the air feels heavier than your thoughts, and everything seems slightly off-kilter. I had just moved to a new city for work, a half-baked attempt at a fresh start after a few lousy years. The apartment complex was nothing special. Beige walls, faint smell of mildew in the hallways, and a neighbor's cat that always seemed to be watching me from the window across the courtyard. I didn't know anyone in town yet, which suited me just fine. I liked being invisible. The first time I met her was in the elevator. I was carrying a box of takeout and trying not to drop my keys when the door slid open, and there she was. Petite, maybe mid-40s, with short blonde hair tucked behind her ears and a crisp white blouse that looked way too nice for our shabby building. She smiled warmly, the kind of smile you don't usually get from strangers in big cities. "New here?" she asked. Her voice was smooth, measured. "Yeah," I replied, juggling the box and my keys. "Moved in a week ago." She glanced at the takeout box in my hand and tilted her head. "Thai food? From Green Orchid on 3rd Street, right?" "Great choice. The yellow curry is amazing." I blinked. She was right, it was from Green Orchid. Yeah, that's the one. Good guess, I said with a nervous laugh. She smiled again, but didn't say anything else as the elevator dinged and the doors opened to my floor. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe she was just good at recognizing takeout boxes. But over the next few weeks, I started seeing her more often. At first, it was little things. She'd be in the laundry room folding towels when I came in, or walking out of the mailroom just as I arrived. She always had the same warm smile, and every time, she'd comment on something personal. Got a new haircut, didn't you? Looks great, she said once, even though I was pretty sure I'd never run into her in the hallway before. Or, you're really into iced lattes, huh? Saw you with one yesterday, too. That one threw me. I had been drinking iced lattes, but not in the building. I usually grabbed them from a cafe 2 blocks away on my lunch break. How would she know that? I started feeling uneasy around her, but she never did anything overtly weird. She was just friendly, maybe too much so. I kept trying to brush it off. People were nosy sometimes. Big deal. Then one night, I came home late from work. The hallway was dark. The building's ancient light fixtures flickered and buzzed like something out of a horror movie. As I reached my door, I noticed a shadow in the corner of my eye. Someone was standing at the end of the hall. It was her. Late night? She asked, her voice cutting through the stillness. Yeah, work ran late, I replied, fumbling with my keys. I didn't ask why she was there. I just wanted to get inside. I always tell people it's dangerous to work late, she said. You never know who's out there, watching. Her words lingered long after I closed the door. I told myself it was harmless, maybe just her version of a friendly warning. But my nerves wouldn't settle. I double-checked the locks and left the lights on that night. The next day, I made a point of avoiding her. I started taking the stairs instead of the elevator, and I skipped my usual Sunday laundry routine, hoping she'd get the hint. For a while it worked. I didn't see her again for nearly 2 weeks, and I convinced myself I'd been overreacting. Maybe I was just paranoid from being in a new place. Then the note started. The first one was taped to my door. Hope you're settling in okay. Let me know if you need anything. There was no L listed in the directory, but I figured it was her. I crumpled the note and threw it away, trying not to think about it. The second note showed up in my mailbox a few days later. You should really water your plants more. They're looking sad. That one made my stomach twist. My plants were in my living room, out of sight from anyone who wasn't inside my apartment. I barely slept that night, every creak and groan of the building setting my nerves on edge. The next morning, I went straight to the building manager to complain. He listened, frowning, as I described her. Short blonde hair, white blouse, kind of chatty. I asked, hoping he'd know exactly who I meant. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. Sorry, he said after a long pause. No one like that lives here. Maybe she's visiting someone. I walked out of his office more confused than ever. The next time I saw her was in the courtyard. She was sitting on a bench, sipping tea from a dainty porcelain cup that looked out of place in our dingy complex. When she saw me, she smiled, her usual warm, unsettling smile. Heading out? She asked, as though we were old friends. Who are you? I blurted, my voice sharper than I intended. Her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. Just your neighbor, she said softly. We all look out for each other here. I walked away without saying another word, my chest tight with unease. That night, I woke up to the sound of something tapping against my bedroom window. My apartment was on the 5th floor. I didn't open the curtains. I didn't sleep either. The next day, I packed a bag and left. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Didn't leave a forwarding address. I moved across the city to a different apartment, one with better locks and no strange neighbors. For a while, things felt normal again. I started sleeping better, telling myself it was all in my head. But last week, I found a note under my new door. Missed you. Let's catch up soon. I still don't know who she is or how she found me, but I keep my curtains closed and I never, ever work late anymore. Let's start a new story. It began with a photograph I didn't recognize. I'd been scrolling through my phone one lazy Sunday afternoon, aimlessly flicking through pictures when I stumbled across it. The photo was simple enough. My living room, dimly lit by the warm glow of my standing lamp, my coffee table in its usual cluttered state. But something was off. The angle was wrong. Low, as if someone had been crouching near the floor. I don't take pictures like that. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, trying to remember if maybe I'd accidentally taken it. But the timestamp froze my breath. It was from 2:34 a.m. 2 nights ago. I'd been asleep. That night, I locked every door and window in my tiny house twice, turned on every light, and stayed up until dawn, phone clutched in my shaking hands. Nothing happened, and by morning I told myself there had to be an explanation. Some glitch, maybe, or a prank. It was easier than the alternative. I deleted the photo. But over the next week, things started happening. Subtle at first. I'd find my books rearranged on the shelf. Not haphazardly, but in a perfect ascending line by size. My kitchen chairs would be pulled out from the table in neat, identical angles. Once, I woke up to find all my shoes lined up at the foot of my bed. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was stressed, working too hard. But the excuses stopped working when I woke up to the sound of movement in my living room at 3 a.m. I lay there, heart pounding, listening to the distinct creak of floorboards. Someone or something was there. I wanted to grab my phone, call the police, but it was in the living room, charging. My only weapon was a lamp. I clutched it like a lifeline and crept to the door. When I peeked into the living room, it was empty. At least that's what I thought. The air was heavy, oppressive, like a thunderstorm was about to break inside my home. I flicked on the light, and that's when I saw it. Every surface of my living room was covered in post-it notes. Yellow squares plastered the walls, the furniture, the ceiling, each one meticulously placed, each one with the same 2 words scrawled in jagged black ink. Who are you? My breath caught in my throat, and my legs nearly gave out. I wanted to scream, but the silence was so dense, so unnatural, that breaking it felt dangerous. I backed into my bedroom, slammed the door, and didn't open it again until sunlight seeped through the cracks in the blinds. The notes were gone by morning. My living room was clean, untouched. I spent hours pacing, trying to convince myself it was a nightmare. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I took the next day off work and installed a security camera in the corner of my living room, angled to capture everything. That night, I left every light on, locked myself in my bedroom, and stared at the live feed on my phone until I finally drifted off. The motion alert woke me at 2:47 a.m. My phone buzzed relentlessly, my screen lighting up with a feed of my living room. At first, I didn't see anything, just the empty, overlit room. Then the lights started going out, one by one. I froze, watching as darkness crawled across the screen. And then I saw it. In the center of the room, the air shimmered faintly, like heat rising off asphalt. But instead of fading, it grew, coalescing into a shape, a figure. At first, it was formless, just a mass of shadow and movement, but then it stretched and twisted until it looked almost human. Almost. Its arms were too long, its head tilted too far to the side, like it was studying the camera with an unnatural curiosity. It moved closer and closer until its face, or what should have been a face, filled the screen. The shadows shifted and writhed where its eyes should have been, like something trying to claw its way out. Then the feed cut to black. I didn't sleep that night, or the next, or the next. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, that thing staring at me through the camera. I threw the security system out, but it didn't help. The phenomena escalated. Lights flickered constantly. Scratches appeared on the walls, long, jagged lines that formed nonsensical patterns. My phone filled up with pictures I hadn't taken. Images of my house, of me sleeping, of that same shadowy figure standing in the corner of my bedroom. I called my landlord, begged him to let me out of my lease, but he just laughed. People always say that about this place, he said. What did you see? His tone was casual, amused, like this was a joke he'd heard too many times. I hung up on him. The last night I spent in that house was the worst. I woke up to the sound of whispering, low and guttural, coming from just outside my bedroom door. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, desperate. I sat frozen in bed, clutching the lamp again until the whispering stopped. Then the door handle began to turn. I don't remember much after that. Just running, bare feet on cold pavement, until I reached my car and drove as far as I could. When I finally stopped, I was in the parking lot of an all-night diner, shaking so hard I couldn't hold the steering wheel. I don't know what that thing was, or why it chose me. I don't think I want to know. I've moved twice since then, changed my number, even changed my name. But sometimes I wake up to the sound of whispering. Sometimes I find my books rearranged or my lights flickering. And sometimes I'll be scrolling through my phone and find a picture I didn't take. It's always of me, asleep, and the shadow is always there, standing in the corner, just a little closer than the last time. Let's start a new story. It started the day I moved into my new apartment, a modest one-bedroom in a quiet complex on the outskirts of town. I'd been desperate to find a place after my last roommate situation fell apart. So when this unit opened up, I jumped on it. The building seemed nice enough, clean and quiet, with an older demographic. No screaming kids or late-night parties, a win in my book. My first interaction with him was uneventful, almost pleasant. I was unloading boxes from my car when he walked up, a man in his late 40s or early 50s, dressed casually in a flannel shirt and jeans. He introduced himself as Rick from upstairs and offered to help carry a particularly heavy box. Grateful, I let him, and he made small talk as we climbed the stairs. He asked where I'd moved from and what I did for work. His questions were normal enough, if a little persistent, but I chalked it up to friendliness. It wasn't until I saw how he lingered after we'd brought the box inside that I started feeling a little uneasy. "You're lucky to get this unit," he said, standing in my doorway and looking around. The last tenant, well, she didn't last long. Strange girl, always kept to herself. He laughed awkwardly, like he'd just shared an inappropriate joke. When I didn't laugh back, he added, "But hey, I'm around if you ever need anything. Don't be a stranger." For the next few weeks, I didn't see much of Rick. Every now and then, I'd hear his footsteps above me or his door slamming late at night. But that was it. Then, one evening, as I was locking up to go for a run, I nearly walked into him standing just outside my door. It startled me. He hadn't knocked or announced himself, just hovered there like he'd been waiting. "Hey there," he said, smiling wide. "Didn't mean to scare you. I just noticed your light was on and thought I'd check in. Everything good here? You settling in okay?" I nodded, unsure how to respond. His tone was friendly enough, but something about his timing was odd. Why was he just hanging around? I kept the conversation brief, thanked him for his concern, and went on my run. Over the next month, Rick's presence became more frequent. At first, it was little things, passing by my window when I was home, stopping me in the hallway to ask innocuous questions, like if I'd tried the local diner or needed recommendations for plumbers. Then came the comments that felt off. One day, he mentioned how he'd seen me carrying groceries and noted, "You don't eat much junk, huh? Healthy girl. That's good. Can't have just anyone eating poorly around here." Another time, he complimented the curtains I'd hung, saying, "I love how those look from outside. Really makes your place stand out." It was that comment that stuck with me. How did he know what they looked like from outside? I kept brushing it off, convincing myself that he was just a lonely guy who didn't know how to set boundaries. But as the weeks wore on, my gut kept whispering something different. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They weren't particularly loud, but they were slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing. I glanced at my clock, 3:47 a.m. My first thought was that someone was drunk or restless, but the sound didn't fade. After several minutes, I crept to my door and peered through the peephole. Rick was there, standing motionless in front of my door. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him lean in, almost as if he was listening for something. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Sleep deprivation does weird things to people, right? Still, I started taking precautions, keeping my blinds drawn, double-checking my locks, even moving a chair in front of the door at night. When I ran into Rick the following afternoon, he acted like nothing had happened. He waved, asked about my weekend plans, and even joked about the weather. His demeanor was so casual, so disarming, that I almost felt guilty for being suspicious. But then the incidents escalated. I started finding things slightly out of place in my apartment. A coffee mug that I was sure I'd left in the sink would be on the counter. A pair of shoes I'd kicked off near the door would be neatly lined up against the wall. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful, stressed out from work. Then, one day, I came home to find my mail I hadn't yet picked up, sitting neatly stacked on my kitchen table. I froze. My hands started shaking as I checked every lock and window, but nothing seemed tampered with. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside, that someone had been Rick. I started avoiding him entirely, timing my comings and goings to when I knew he wouldn't be around. But he always found a way to show up. He'd knock on my door late at night with excuses like borrowing sugar or asking if I'd heard strange noises. One time, I didn't answer, and he called out, "I know you're in there. I saw your light." My stomach dropped. The final straw came 2 nights ago. I was taking out the trash when I saw him standing at the far end of the lot, partially obscured by a tree. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just watched as I walked to the dumpster and back. I tried to act like I hadn't noticed him, but the weight of his gaze burned into me. When I reached my door, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You look nice tonight." I stared at the message, my chest tightening. My hands fumbled as I bolted the door and shoved the chair under the knob. The police couldn't do much without proof. I knew that. But the thought of staying here another night made my skin crawl. I packed an overnight bag and left, not caring where I went as long as it wasn't there. Now I'm sitting in a motel room, writing this. My heart is pounding, and I can't stop looking at the window, half expecting to see his face peering in. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I misread all the signs. But deep down, I don't think I did. Something about Rick wasn't right, and I'm not waiting around to find out what. Let's start a new story. When I moved into the new apartment, I was thrilled. It was a small studio on the 3rd floor of a quiet building, the kind where you never see your neighbors, but always hear muffled signs of life. The rent was suspiciously low, but the place had been recently renovated, and I convinced myself it was just my luck for finding a great deal. The first night, I unpacked a few essentials, laid my mattress on the floor, and passed out from exhaustion. I barely registered the faint creak of the floorboards or the occasional drip from the kitchen sink. Every old building has its quirks, I thought. The next morning, I woke to a minor oddity. My keys, which I'd left on the counter, were now on the coffee table. I chalked it up to moving fatigue. Maybe I'd carried them there without realizing it. I shrugged it off, made some coffee, and decided to get on with the day. By noon, I had rearranged some furniture and hung a few posters. It was starting to feel like home. That night, after finishing a late dinner, I noticed something else. The chair by the window was facing the wrong way. I distinctly remembered angling it toward the view of the street, but now it was facing the wall. For a moment, I felt a prickle of unease but brushed it aside. Maybe I bumped it while unpacking. The next day brought more peculiarities. The books I'd lined up neatly on the shelf were shuffled into a new order. My toothbrush, which I always kept in the holder, was lying flat on the sink. Small things, all easily dismissed. I told myself I must have been scatterbrained with all the chaos of moving. Still, the incidents piled up until it was impossible to ignore them. One morning, I found my bedroom lamp in the kitchen. A picture frame was missing, only to reappear hours later in a different room. My sense of reality began to wobble, but I convinced myself it was nothing, an overactive imagination, stress, maybe even sleepwalking. The breaking point came 3 weeks in. I returned home from work one evening and froze in the doorway. The apartment was the same, but the details were all wrong. The couch was on the opposite wall. My kitchen utensils were lined up neatly on the counter, as if on display. The rug had been flipped over, exposing its underside. Everything looked intentional, not chaotic, not accidental, like someone had carefully decided where each item should go. I called the landlord, trying to keep the panic from my voice. He sounded irritated. "No one's been in your unit," he said firmly. "You're the only one with a key." His reassurance did little to ease my mind. That night, I stayed up, keeping every light in the apartment on, listening to the faint creaks and groans of the building. When I finally drifted off around 3 a.m., I dreamed of the apartment shifting. Walls flexed and stretched like lungs. Furniture slid across the floor in smooth, fluid motions, and shadows twisted into shapes I couldn't understand. When I woke, I was drenched in sweat, and the dream seemed to linger in the air around me, as if I'd brought it back into the waking world. The next few days turned into a nightmare. The changes became more pronounced. I'd come home to find drawers emptied and their contents stacked neatly on the floor. My shoes were lined up in a perfect row, pointing toward the door, though I always left them scattered by the entrance. Every time, I tried to convince myself it was just me, but deep down I knew. One night, I set up my phone to record while I slept. When I checked the footage the next morning, my stomach turned to ice. The video showed the room in darkness for hours, completely still. Then, at 3:14 a.m., the closet door opened slowly, as if pushed from the inside. Nothing came out. The door stayed ajar for a few minutes before closing just as carefully. I stared at the screen, replaying the clip over and over, trying to convince myself it was some trick of the light or a draft. But it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. I decided to leave, but when I started packing, things got worse. My suitcase vanished. I found it hours later, stuffed under the bed with its contents scattered around the apartment. My clothes were draped over chairs, hanging from light fixtures, even folded neatly inside the refrigerator. I didn't remember putting any of them there. I tried calling a friend for help, but my phone wouldn't work. The screen stayed black, no matter how long I held the power button. I finally managed to shove some essentials into a backpack and ran for the door. But the hallway outside was wrong. It stretched longer than it should have, lined with doors I didn't recognize. The air felt heavier, almost sticky, and the lights flickered erratically. My panic rose as I walked, each step echoing too loudly. I tried knocking on the nearest door, but no one answered. When I turned back toward my apartment, the door wasn't there anymore, just a blank wall where it had been. I stumbled down the hall, disoriented, until I saw something that stopped me cold. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway. It was indistinct, more shadow than person, but I could feel its gaze. I backed away slowly, and the figure didn't move. When I turned the corner, the hallway looped back to the same spot. The figure was closer now, just standing there, waiting. I don't know how many times I circled that hallway, but every turn brought me back to the same scene. The blank wall, the flickering lights, the shadow figure inching closer. I screamed until my throat was raw, but the sound barely echoed in the oppressive silence. When I finally collapsed, exhausted and terrified, the hallway faded away, and I was back in the apartment. Everything was exactly as it had been when I first moved in, except for one detail. On the coffee table sat a photo I'd never seen before. It was a picture of me, sitting on the couch, staring blankly ahead. In the background, just barely visible, was the shadow figure standing behind me. I don't know how I'm still here. Every time I try to leave, the building pulls me back. The apartment shifts and changes, but I can't escape it. The shadow watches me constantly now, no longer waiting at the end of a hallway. It stands closer each day, its presence pressing down on me like a weight I can't lift. I don't know what it wants. I don't know how much longer I can take this. If you're reading this, don't come looking for me. Don't come near this building. I think it's alive, and once it has you, it never lets go. Let's start a new story. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Sunday morning, when I woke up to find my kitchen clock blinking an unfamiliar time. It was 7:45 a.m., which wouldn't have been odd except for the fact that the clock was analog, a hand-wound antique I'd inherited from my grandmother. I stared at it, the minute hand twitching faintly as if caught in some internal glitch, before it sprang forward and stopped on 7:46. I wound it every Saturday night, like clockwork, no pun intended, and it had never faltered before. I chalked it up to a mechanical error, a fluke, and moved on with my day. But the feeling lingered. Something about the way the minute hand twitched reminded me of a creature in pain. It wasn't broken, it was struggling. The rest of the week passed uneventfully, or so I thought, until a co-worker named Andrea asked how my Tuesday presentation had gone. My stomach dropped. "What presentation?" I asked. She frowned. "The one for the quarterly review." You were really intense about it. Honestly, you kind of scared me. I didn't know what to say. I had no memory of a presentation. Andrea must have seen the confusion on my face, because she pulled out her phone and showed me a video she'd taken, one of those shaky, barely focused clips people take to mock office meetings. There I was, standing in front of the conference room, speaking rapidly, gesturing at slides I couldn't recall making. My voice was low, deliberate, and off. I sounded like myself, but colder, detached. At one point, I slammed a hand against the table so hard that Andrea flinched behind the camera. When I finished watching, my hands were trembling. I don't remember any of that, I whispered. Andrea laughed nervously. Yeah, you're a hard guy to read sometimes, but are you okay? I nodded quickly, making excuses about stress and lack of sleep, but inside, I felt like the floor had tilted beneath me. I wanted to confront someone, my boss, my team, anyone who might remember more than I did, but I was terrified of what they might say. What else had I done? What else had I forgotten? The next morning, I woke up sitting upright in my bed, fully dressed, my hands clutching my phone. I didn't remember falling asleep like that, and when I unlocked the screen, a string of text messages greeted me. They were all sent to someone named Victor, a name I didn't recognize with a number I didn't have saved. Each message was stranger than the last. 10:12 p.m., it's starting again. 11:04 p.m., this time I'll watch. 12:37 a.m. Where do you keep the other one? The text went on like that, disjointed and ominous, until the last one at 2:14 a.m., which simply read, I see it now. I tried calling the number, but it went straight to voicemail. A man's voice greeted me, deep and unsettling, the kind you'd imagine coming from the shadows of a forest. Victor isn't here right now, it said, but maybe you are? Then it beeped, leaving me in stunned silence. Panic set in. I tore through my apartment, searching for anything out of place. My closets, my drawers, even the crawl space above my bathroom ceiling. I opened every inch of the place, but everything was exactly as it should have been. Except it wasn't. I found myself unable to shake the sense that I was looking at a perfect replica of my home, something painstakingly recreated to fool me. It wasn't the objects themselves. It was the way they felt. My favorite coffee mug seemed heavier in my hand. My couch cushions didn't quite sink the same way they used to. And my bedroom window, though it looked normal, seemed like it wasn't letting in light, but pretending to. I don't know how else to describe it. By the time night fell, I felt more like a visitor in my own space than the person who'd lived there for 6 years. Then came the dream, or at least I think it was a dream. I was sitting in my kitchen again, staring at the clock, which now displayed a time that wasn't possible. 99:99. The minute hand spun wildly, faster and faster, until it broke off and fell to the bottom of the clock face with a hollow clink. The kitchen light flickered, and I realized someone was standing behind me. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them, close enough that I could hear their breathing. My body felt leaden, like I was strapped to the chair, and when I tried to turn my head, the figure whispered, "No need to look. You're already doing fine." I woke up drenched in sweat, my kitchen clock sitting silently on the counter, hands exactly where I'd left them. But the feeling lingered, a heavy knot in my chest that refused to ease. The next day it happened again. Andrea wouldn't look me in the eye at work, and my boss called me into his office to ask about an email I'd sent the previous night. "You're taking this strategy thing pretty seriously, huh?" he said, trying to keep it light. I had no idea what he was talking about. When I checked my sent folder, I saw an email addressed to half the office, filled with jargon and charts I didn't understand. The language was sharp, commanding, almost threatening. And at the very end, a single sentence stood out. "We've already begun the second phase. You know what to do." I left work early that day, claiming I was sick, though sick didn't begin to cover it. I felt unmoored, like my mind and body were slipping further out of sync with each passing hour. Every noise in my apartment made me jump. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. The breaking point came that night. I was brushing my teeth when I caught sight of myself in the mirror. I looked tired, gaunt, my skin pale and waxy under the fluorescent light. But then I blinked, and my reflection didn't. It stood there, staring at me, its lips twitching upward in a slow, deliberate smile. I stumbled back, knocking over the toothbrush holder, but the reflection didn't move. Instead, it mouthed 3 words, soundless but unmistakable. "It's your turn." I don't know how long I sat on the bathroom floor after that. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep, because when I opened my eyes, it was morning and the mirror was empty. Now, I'm left with more questions than answers. I don't know who or what Victor is. I don't know why my reflection doesn't always follow me. And I don't know how much of my life is still mine, or if it ever was to begin with. All I know is this: the kitchen clock has started blinking again. Let's start a new story. The first sign was the shoes. Not the kind of detail you'd usually pick up on, but I did. They were these polished loafers with a faint, almost invisible scratch running down the left toe. I remembered them because Sarah always joked about how I could scuff even steel-toed boots. But there they were, sitting by the door, and I hadn't worn them in months. When I asked her about it, she blinked at me like I'd asked her to solve a calculus problem. "Oh, I wore them to grab the mail," she said with a dismissive laugh. "Didn't want to ruin my slippers in the rain." It hadn't rained in weeks. I let it slide. Next came the missing lemon bars. A stupid thing to notice, I know, but Sarah hated lemon bars. Said they were gritty and too sour. I loved them, though, and when I brought a box home one evening, I expected them to last a week. 2 days later, they were gone. She swore I must have eaten them, and when I said I hadn't, she laughed. "What, you think the cat got into them?" she joked. But I knew she didn't touch lemon anything. That night, I stayed up later than usual, sitting in the dark while she slept, my mind tangling itself into knots. I told myself I was being paranoid, that these weren't signs of anything except my overactive imagination. Still, I couldn't stop replaying small moments in my head. The way she'd been dressing lately. Not sexy or flashy, but deliberate, like someone was watching her, and she wanted to make a good impression. The sudden influx of work trips that hadn't been a thing before. The way her phone never left her hand, even when she went to the bathroom. And then there was the humming. It wasn't just any humming. It was a song I didn't recognize. She hummed it when she thought I wasn't paying attention. A soft, lilting tune that felt out of place, foreign. Sarah wasn't the musical type. She never hummed anything. I asked her about it once, and she shrugged. "Just something I heard on the radio," she said. But it stuck to her like a name you can't forget. I found myself humming it too, unconsciously, like a virus passed from one person to another. The breaking point came on a Sunday. We were supposed to have brunch with friends, but Sarah claimed she wasn't feeling well. She looked fine, better than fine, actually. Her hair was curled just so, her makeup fresh, her nails painted in a shade I hadn't seen her wear before. When I asked if she was sure, she snapped, "Do you want me to puke on everyone?" I left for brunch alone. When I got home, her car was gone. I sat in the driveway, staring at the empty space where it should have been, and felt something crack inside me. I called her. She didn't answer. 10 minutes later, she texted, "Out for a drive. Needed air." When she came home, she smelled faintly of cologne. Not mine, not hers. Something darker, spicier, with a sharp edge that lingered in the air between us. I asked her about it, and she laughed, waving me off. "Must have been the valet," she said. I didn't press her. I was tired of pressing, of asking questions that danced around the truth. So I waited. I waited for the next lie, the next small inconsistency. And it didn't take long. A week later, I came home early from work. Sarah wasn't expecting me. Her car was in the driveway, but the house was too quiet. My footsteps sounded loud on the hardwood floors as I made my way to the living room. And that's when I saw it, the shoes. Not mine, not hers. A pair of scuffed brown boots, caked with dried mud, sitting neatly by the couch. My chest tightened. I called out her name. No answer. I followed the faint sound of voices to the back porch, my heart hammering so loud I thought they might hear it. The glass door was slightly ajar, and through it I saw her. She was sitting on the swing, leaning toward a man I didn't recognize. He was older, his hair graying at the temples, his smile warm and easy. She laughed at something he said, a laugh I hadn't heard in months. I didn't step outside. I didn't confront them. Instead, I stood there, frozen, as pieces of the past few months fell into place. The lemon bars, the song, the cologne, it wasn't paranoia. It was breadcrumbs leading me to this moment. When I finally stepped away, my hands were trembling. I didn't pack a bag or write a note. I didn't even slam the door on my way out. I just left, the weight of her laugh ringing in my ears. I drove aimlessly for hours, replaying every lie, every excuse, every moment I'd ignored my gut. By the time I pulled into a motel parking lot, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the asphalt. I checked in, collapsed onto the stiff mattress, and stared at the ceiling. In the silence, I started humming. The song. Her song. It didn't feel foreign anymore. It felt like closure. Let's start a new story. It all began with a flash of color, a green scarf fluttering in the breeze. I was sitting on a bench at the park during my lunch break, scrolling aimlessly through my phone and half listening to the chatter of kids on the playground. The scarf caught my eye first, bright against the dull November sky. It belonged to a man standing by the duck pond, tossing bits of bread into the water. He looked completely ordinary, mid-30s, dark hair, wearing a tan overcoat that swayed slightly in the wind. But there was something about him I couldn't pin down. He seemed too still, like the scene around him wasn't happening for him the way it was for everyone else. For a moment, I thought he might have noticed me watching, but when I glanced up again, he was gone. The encounter slipped from my mind until 2 days later. I was in line at my favorite bakery, running late for work and debating whether to splurge on a croissant when I saw him again. He was standing on the sidewalk just outside the window, leaning casually against a lamppost, scrolling on his phone. This time, the green scarf was gone, but it was unmistakably him. My stomach turned, a strange, instinctive reaction that I couldn't explain. He wasn't doing anything odd, just being there. But when I left the bakery with my coffee and pastry, he was nowhere to be seen. By the third time, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I was at the grocery store, trying to wrestle a jar of pasta sauce off the top shelf, when he appeared at the end of the aisle. He wasn't doing anything, just staring at a display of soup cans, but the sight of him made my hands tremble. I knocked the jar onto the floor, and the crash drew his attention. His eyes flicked to mine, and then he smiled, a tight, polite expression, as if we were distant acquaintances. I tried to return the smile, but it came out all wrong. Without thinking, I abandoned my cart and left the store. That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying the day's events. Maybe it was nothing. It's a big city. People cross paths all the time. But as much as I tried to convince myself, my gut told me otherwise. There was no reason to think he was following me. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if he were some faint shadow lingering just at the edges of my vision. The next morning, I hesitated before leaving for work, glancing out the window like a paranoid character in a thriller. The street was empty, save for the usual rush hour commuters. Still, I felt like prey stepping out of my apartment, the air too cold and too sharp against my skin. The day passed without incident, but when I returned home that evening, something was off. My door was locked as usual, and nothing appeared out of place inside. Yet when I walked into the kitchen, I froze. Sitting on the counter was a single business card, black, embossed with no logo or name, just a phone number. My chest tightened as I stared at it, trying to convince myself I'd just overlooked it before. But I knew my kitchen. I lived alone. There was no way that card had been there in the morning. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the old apartment felt magnified, every shadow a potential intruder. I kept my phone gripped in my hand, thumb hovering over 911, but no one came. By dawn, I convinced myself to call the number. The line clicked, but no one spoke. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. Silence. Then, just as I was about to hang up, a faint whisper crackled through the receiver. "I like the park." The phone slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Was it him? It had to be. But how did he know where I lived? How had he gotten inside? For days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the crowd, looking for that tan coat, that unreadable face. But he didn't show up. Not at work, not at the grocery store, not even at the park. Instead, I started finding things. A folded paper crane left on my windshield, A note tucked into my mailbox that read, "It's a nice neighborhood." Once, a green scarf was draped neatly over the back of my chair at a coffee shop. No one around me had seen who left it. The fear grew unbearable. I stopped going out unless absolutely necessary, working from home and ordering groceries online. Even then, the deliveries came with oddities, a loaf of bread with a slip of paper tucked inside the bag. Feeding the ducks is peaceful, isn't it? One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps in my apartment. My heart leapt to my throat as I grabbed the bat I kept under the bed. I crept into the hallway, gripping the bat so tightly my knuckles ached. The apartment was silent again. Nothing out of place, no open doors or windows. I was starting to think I'd imagined it until I saw the folded paper crane on the floor just outside my bedroom. I called the police that time. They came quickly, swept through the apartment, checked the locks and windows. Nothing. The officer was kind, but skeptical. "Probably just a prank," he said. "Maybe one of your neighbors?" He didn't seem to believe me, and honestly, I wasn't sure I believed myself. But it didn't stop. The man with the green scarf, always out of reach, but always near. The little signs that he'd been in my space. The gnawing certainty that this was more than a coincidence. I felt like a rabbit in a snare, struggling against something invisible and unrelenting. The last straw came when I found a photograph taped to my bathroom mirror. It was of me, sitting on the park bench the day I first saw him. The angle was distant, but unmistakable. Scrawled across the bottom in thin, uneven handwriting were 3 words. "You noticed me." I left my apartment that same day, packed a suitcase, and moved into a cheap motel on the other side of the city. It's been a week, and so far he hasn't found me. At least, I think he hasn't. But sometimes, when I pass by a window or glance down a quiet street, I catch a flicker of green, a flash of movement that vanishes before I can be sure. And I can't stop wondering if this is over, or if he's just taking his time. Let's start a new story. The children. It was late last October when I moved into the duplex on Crestwood Drive, an old 2-story building with cracked stucco walls and a front yard overrun by ivy. The landlord had offered a suspiciously low rent, which I ignored because I was desperate to escape my overpriced shoebox of an apartment downtown. The place came partially furnished, and while most of the furniture looked outdated, I didn't mind. There was a small bookshelf in the living room filled with dusty old books, a sagging couch, and a set of mismatched dining chairs. But what caught my attention immediately was the mirror in the upstairs hallway. It wasn't part of the listing photos, and I didn't even notice it when I toured the house. It hung at the end of the hall, taller than me and framed with intricately carved wood that resembled twisting branches and thorny vines. Its glass was slightly cloudy, with a faint gold sheen when the light hit it just right. The first night I moved in, I realized the mirror gave me the creeps. Maybe it was how it seemed to loom over the hallway, or the way my reflection always looked a little off. I try not to think about it. Moving is exhausting, and I chalked my unease up to stress. It wasn't until a week later that I first heard the laughter. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it faintly light, high-pitched giggles like children playing a game of hide-and-seek. It came from somewhere outside, or at least it's what I told myself. The clock read 2:13 a.m. when the laughter stopped, so I convinced myself it must have been some neighbor's kid sneaking out late. But then it happened again the next night. This time it was louder, closer, like it was coming from the walls. I crept into the hallway, my heart pounding, and stopped in front of the mirror. I stared at my reflection, half expecting it to move on its own. Instead, everything was still, just me standing there in my oversized sweatshirt, hair a mess. I turned to go back to bed, but as I walked away, I saw it. Movement. In the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow dart across the mirror. My stomach flipped, and I whipped back around, but there was nothing there. Just me and the empty hallway. I didn't sleep at all that night. The laughter grew louder as the days passed, and soon it wasn't just laughter anymore. I started hearing whispers, faint and unintelligible, like someone having a conversation just out of earshot. It always seemed to come from the mirror. I decided I'd had enough and tried to move the thing. I grabbed the edge of the frame, planning to haul it downstairs and out to the curb, but the mirror wouldn't budge. It felt like it was bolted to the wall, though I couldn't see any screws or brackets holding it in place. Frustrated, I threw a blanket over it and decided to ignore it. That worked for a while, until the blanket came off. I found it crumpled on the floor one morning, even though I was sure I'd secured it tightly. I stared at the uncovered mirror, and for a moment, I thought my reflection was smiling at me. Not a normal smile, but something too wide, too sharp, like the kind of grin a predator gives before pouncing. I blinked, and the expression was gone, replaced by my own pale, terrified face. That night, I heard the laughter again. This time it wasn't coming from the walls, it was coming from inside my room. I turned on every light and sat with my back against the headboard, clutching a baseball bat I'd found in the closet. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink. The next morning, I called the landlord. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I told him the mirror was just unsettling and asked if I could take it down. He was quiet for a long time before he finally said, "The mirror stays. It's part of the house." Something in his tone made my skin crawl. That evening, I noticed something new. The mirror had changed. The cloudy glass was clearer now, almost pristine, and the frame's carving seemed more detailed. I leaned in, studying the twisting vines, and realized they weren't just decorative. They were figures, children, dozens of them, their tiny faces twisted in agony, their limbs tangled in the wooden branches. I backed away, horrified, and that's when I saw them. There were children in the mirror, not reflections, actual children staring out from the other side of the glass. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow, as if they hadn't seen sunlight in years. One of them pressed her hand against the glass, and I swear I felt the cold seeping through. "Help us," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, and ran downstairs. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for air. I stayed at a hotel that night, too scared to go back. The next day, I hired a professional to remove the mirror. I didn't care about the landlord's rules anymore. I just wanted it gone. The guy I hired was a burly man who looked like he could bench press a truck, but even he couldn't budge the mirror. He tried prying off the wall, but his tools snapped like twigs. Frustrated, he told me it wasn't worth the trouble and left. I didn't go near the mirror again after that. I started sleeping downstairs on the couch, leaving all the lights on. But the children didn't stay in the mirror. The first time I saw them outside of it was 2 nights ago. I woke up to the sound of footsteps, tiny and quick, running across the hardwood floor. I sat up, and there they were, standing in the doorway. Dozens of them, their hollow eyes fixed on me. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stared. I don't know how I'm still here. I don't know why they haven't taken me yet. Last night, I found a note on the kitchen counter, written in a child's shaky handwriting. It said, "You're next. I can't leave. I've tried. Every time I walk out the front door, I find myself right back inside, standing in front of the mirror. I don't eat anymore. I don't sleep. I just sit here waiting. The children are getting closer." Let's start a new story. It began with a drip. I first noticed it one night while lying in bed, half asleep. A steady rhythmic sound, soft but insistent. Drip, 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 groaning. I sat up, convinced I'd left the kitchen faucet running. But when I stumbled out of bed to check, it was bone dry. Back in the bedroom, the sound continued. This time, it seemed to come from the corner where my dresser stood. The dim glow from the street lamp outside cast just enough light to make out its silhouette, but nothing appeared out of place. Still, the dripping persisted, louder now, accompanied by the faintest plip of liquid pooling on the floor. I crept closer, half expecting to find a burst pipe or some kind of leak. Instead, there was nothing. The floor was dry, the dresser unmarked. The sound stopped as abruptly as it started, leaving me in suffocating silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for it to return. It didn't. The next morning, I told myself it had been a dream. For a while, that explanation worked. The sound didn't come back, but the next strange thing happened about a week later. I was getting ready for work, brushing my teeth, when I glanced at my reflection and froze. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. Everything looked fine. Same bathroom, same dim lighting, same tired face staring back at me. But there was something wrong with the reflection. It wasn't mine. The face in the mirror was subtly off, barely perceptible differences that made it feel alien. The jawline was sharper, the eyes a fraction too far apart, the cheekbones higher than my own. Like someone had taken my features and rearranged them into a stranger wearing my skin. I blinked, and it was normal again. For weeks, I carried that unease around like a splinter lodged too deep to pull free. Other small things began to pile up, each one easy to dismiss on its own, but impossible to ignore when taken together. I'd wake up and find my closet door open, even though I always kept it shut. My phone would buzz with notifications, only for the screen to be blank when I checked it. One night, I went to make dinner and found my fridge stocked with food I didn't remember buying, food I didn't even like. Once, I heard someone knock on my door at 3 a.m. By the time I got there, the hallway was empty, but there was a single, wet footprint on the doormat. Things escalated when the people around me started changing. At first, it was subtle. My boss, Linda, who always wore her hair in a tight bun, started leaving it down. She wore bright lipstick now, too, scarlet red, a color that didn't suit her at all. When I complimented her on it, she stared at me like I'd said something deeply offensive. "I've always worn it this way," she said flatly, her voice lacking the usual warmth. The next day, she came to work with her hair back in a bun, no lipstick in sight. When I mentioned it, she looked at me blankly. "What are you talking about? I haven't changed anything." Other people started acting strangely too. My neighbor, Mark, who'd borrowed my ladder a few months back, returned it with no memory of ever taking it. The guy at the deli gave me a sandwich I hadn't ordered but insisted it was my usual. Even my sister, Anna, seemed different, less animated, her smile too stiff, her laughter hollow. One night, while video chatting with her, the screen froze for a moment. When it unfroze, her face was wrong. Her mouth was smiling, but her eyes weren't. They stared at me, unblinking, unfeeling, for a full 10 seconds before the connection cut out. When I called her back, she acted like nothing had happened. The final straw came 2 nights ago. I woke up to the sound of scratching. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, a tree branch against the window, maybe. But the longer I lay there, the clearer it became that it was inside. I turned on the bedside lamp, and my heart nearly stopped. There was a figure crouched in the corner of my room, its back to me. The thing was pale, its skin almost translucent, stretched too tightly over a too thin frame. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and it hunched over something I couldn't see, its clawed fingers working furiously against the floor. The sound was deafening now. For a moment, I couldn't move. My body was frozen, paralyzed by primal terror. Then, as if sensing my gaze, the thing stopped. Slowly, it turned its head. Its face, or what passed for one, was a blank, featureless plane. No eyes, no nose, just an expanse of smooth, pale flesh. It tilted its head in a grotesque parody of curiosity, then pointed one spindly finger at me. I don't remember screaming, but I must have. When I blinked, the room was empty. The scratches it had been making were still there, though deep, jagged gouges in the wooden floorboards, arranged in no pattern I could recognize. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I'm writing this now because I need someone to know what's happening to me, even if I don't understand it myself. I don't know if I'm losing my mind or if something else is at play, something I can't even begin to comprehend. This morning, I found another wet footprint on the doormat. I haven't opened the door yet, but I think I can hear the dripping again. This time, it's not stopping. Let's start a new story. We just finished moving into a new house, a dusty, sagging relic of the 1920s that my fiancé, Sam, insisted had character. While I wrestled with the idea of living in a place with peeling wallpaper and a basement that smelled like old dirt, Sam was practically giddy over the charm. That first evening, while Sam went out for pizza, I stayed behind to unpack. That's when Garrett knocked on the door. He was standing there in the twilight, about 50, with a too-wide smile and a baseball cap that said country strong. He had the unmistakable air of someone who doesn't know personal space. His shoulders leaned forward as he talked. "Howdy, neighbor," he said, the word dragging out like taffy. "Saw the moving truck earlier. Figured I'd stop by and say welcome." I plastered on my polite smile and muttered thanks, trying not to cringe when he handed me a Tupperware container full of something suspiciously gelatinous. I didn't ask what it was. Let me know if you need help settling in. I live just a hop over there. He gestured to the house across the street. And if you ever hear any strange noises at night, don't be alarmed. This OL neighborhood's full of quirks. What kind of noises? I asked, half joking. But he didn't laugh. His smile faltered, and for the briefest second, his face tightened with something like worry. "Hey, you'll see," he said. "Just, keep your doors locked, and don't pay it no mind." He waved, whistled to his dog, and walked off into the gloom, leaving me holding the Tupperware and a strange knot in my stomach. Later, over cold pizza, I told Sam about Garrett's visit. Sam, always the optimist, shrugged it off. He's probably just one of those nosy neighbors. Every street's got one. He paused mid-bite and gave me a teasing grin. What did he mean by strange noises, though? Think we got ghosts? I rolled my eyes, but the truth was, I didn't know how to shake the weird feeling Garrett had left me with. The first week in the house was unremarkable, aside from a few creaks and groans that were easy to blame on its age. But a few nights in, something strange happened. I woke up around 2 a.m., disoriented, to the sound of a soft hum. It wasn't coming from inside the house, but from somewhere outside, low and rhythmic, almost mechanical. I nudged Sam awake, but by the time he groggily sat up, the sound had stopped. "It's probably nothing," he mumbled, already drifting back to sleep. But it wasn't nothing. Over the next few nights, the humming came back. Always at 2 a.m., always faint and persistent, like a distant engine. I started trying to record it on my phone, but no matter how sharp it sounded to my ears, the playback always came up blank. Sam didn't seem to hear it at all, and I started to feel like I was going crazy. One night, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and the kind of courage that only comes from sheer annoyance, I slipped out the front door and followed the sound. It led me across the street, past Garrett's house, and toward the tree line at the edge of the neighborhood. The closer I got, the louder the hum grew, until it was vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. The woods loomed ahead, dark and oppressive. I hesitated at the edge, questioning my sanity, but curiosity won out. I stepped into the trees. The hum was deafening now, a pulse that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I swept my flashlight over the underbrush, heart racing, until the beam landed on something that made me freeze. It was a door, not a proper door, but a warped wooden slab, crudely built and set into the ground. Dirt and leaves clung to its edges, and there was no handle, just a rusted metal ring in the center. The hum seemed to emanate from below. My pulse pounded as I knelt and grasped the ring. It took all my strength to pull the door open, the hinges groaning like a wounded animal. A foul, earthy smell rushed out, and I gagged. Inside was a narrow tunnel, sloping down into darkness. My flashlight barely pierced the gloom, but I could see enough to know it wasn't natural. The walls were lined with old, crumbling bricks. "Hey!" A voice behind me made me jump so hard I almost dropped the flashlight. I whipped around to find Garrett standing there, his face pale and furious. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed. "What is this?" I shot back, pointing to the door. "Do you hear that noise? It's been waking me up for days." "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice tight. "Go home. Now. Not until you tell me what this is." He hesitated, looking like he was about to argue, but then his face crumpled. "It's better if you don't know," he said softly. "Just stay away from it. Please." I wanted to press him, to demand answers, but something in his tone stopped me. Reluctantly, I let him pull the door shut and watched as he piled dirt and branches over it like he'd done it 100 times before. That night, I didn't sleep. The next day, I tried to convince Sam to go look at the door with me, but he brushed it off. "You probably dreamed it," he said. "Or Garrett's just some weirdo with a storm shelter." He wasn't taking me seriously, and I was starting to feel like I couldn't trust my own mind. Then, the noises changed. Instead of the hum, I started hearing voices. Whispering, just on the edge of perception, like 100 conversations overlapping in a language I didn't understand. Sometimes it felt like they were coming from inside the house. Other times, it was as if they were following me. I went back to the woods alone the next night. The door was gone, completely covered, with no sign it had ever been there. I stormed across the street to Garrett's house, pounding on his door until he finally answered. "You shouldn't have gone out there," he said before I could even speak. "What is it?" I demanded. "What's under that door?" He looked at me for a long time, his face heavy with something that almost looked like pity. "It's not under the door," he said. "It's behind it." I didn't understand what he meant, and I never got the chance to ask. Garrett disappeared the next morning. His house sat empty, his truck still in the driveway, but he was gone. The hum and the whispers stopped after that. I should have been relieved, but the silence felt worse. It's been 3 months. Sam thinks I'm overreacting, but sometimes at night, I still wake up to the sound of faint whispers. And last week, when I was unpacking a box in the basement, I found something tucked into the corner. A rusted metal ring, half buried in the dirt floor. I haven't touched it. Not yet. Let's start a new story. I first noticed the change in the grocery store. Not the usual one I go to. It was a little further out, but I'd been stuck in traffic and figured I'd save time by stopping there instead. It was still a chain, same layout, same glaring fluorescence, but something about it immediately felt wrong. The aisles were too narrow, for one. My shoulders brushed against the shelves as I walked, and the air felt thick, heavy, like a humid summer day. The items on the shelves were normal enough. Boxes of cereal, bags of chips, canned soup, but the labels looked old, faded, as if they'd been there for decades. And the music. God, the music. A tinny, warbled version of a song I couldn't place, playing just low enough to make you strain to hear it. I hurried through, grabbing only what I absolutely needed, and went to check out. The cashier didn't look at me as she rang me up. Her uniform was slightly outdated. No logo, just a pale blue shirt that looked like it had seen better days. Her hands moved quickly, mechanically, scanning the items with precision, but she never made eye contact. When she handed me the receipt, her mouth twitched in what I guess was supposed to be a smile, but it looked like she'd never done it before. Her lips stretched too wide, her teeth unnaturally small. I left without saying anything. On the drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Not a car. I checked my rearview mirror enough times to be sure of that. But something else. It was in the air, pressing against the windows, curling around the tires. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my skin was crawling. When I stepped inside, the house felt colder than it should have. Not cold like the thermostat had been left low, but cold in a way that made me think of basements in old, sealed-off places. I shrugged it off, put away the groceries, and went about my evening. It wasn't until later, when I was brushing my teeth, that I noticed the mirror. It wasn't the reflection that caught my attention. It was the surface of the glass itself. It seemed warped, slightly convex, as though it had been stretched outward. My reflection looked normal, but when I leaned closer, I realized the edges of the glass weren't quite meeting the frame. There was a sliver of darkness all the way around, like the mirror was a window into something else, something deep. I backed away quickly, nearly tripping over the bath mat, and turned off the bathroom light. When I looked at the mirror again in the dark, I could have sworn I saw movement in that thin strip of blackness, something slithering just out of view. The next day, the changes were harder to dismiss. My front yard looked the same, but the sidewalk in front of my house had a crack running down its length that hadn't been there before. My neighbors' cars were parked in their usual spots, but the license plates were strange, longer than normal, with characters I didn't recognize. When I waved at Mrs. Connolly across the street, she stared at me blankly for a moment before raising her hand in a slow, jerky motion. I don't think she blinked the entire time. At work, my desk was where I'd left it, but the view from the window was different. Instead of the familiar skyline, there was a dense, gray fog. I could just barely make out shapes in it, tall, jagged forms that looked almost like buildings, but not quite. When I mentioned it to Sarah, the co-worker who sat next to me, she glanced at the window, frowned, and said, "Looks fine to me." But the way she said it, it was like she was reciting a line from a play, her voice flat and rehearsed. I didn't ask anyone else. By the end of the week, I'd stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw things moving in the corners of my vision. Shadows that didn't belong to anything. I started avoiding mirrors, too. The bathroom mirror had grown worse. The edges of the darkness around the glass were now thicker, almost pulsing. I couldn't bring myself to look at it directly. One night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, like a mouse in the walls, but it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the mirror. I lay frozen in bed, staring at the closed bathroom door. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft tapping. Top, top, top. I don't remember falling back asleep, but when I woke up the next morning, the mirror was gone. In its place was a smooth slab of metal, bolted into the wall. When I asked the landlord about it, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. There was never a mirror there, he said. The fog outside my office window never lifted. In fact, it seemed to get closer each day. The buildings, if they were buildings, became clearer, their angles sharper, more deliberate. I stopped trying to talk to anyone about it. They either didn't see what I saw or refused to acknowledge it. The night before I finally broke, I went for a drive, hoping to clear my head. The road stretched out endlessly, the streetlights dim and flickering. When I glanced at my rearview mirror, I saw something moving in the back seat. Not a person, something else. A shape, black and twisting, like smoke but heavier, more solid. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up, but the thing in the mirror stayed with me the entire time, its form growing sharper, more defined. Now the house isn't the same. The walls are slightly closer together, the floors slanted in ways they shouldn't be. When I open the front door, the street is unfamiliar. The mailbox is gone. My neighbors' houses are still there, but they're wrong. Windows in places they didn't used to be, doors that lead nowhere. Last night, I looked outside and saw Mrs. Connolly standing in her front yard, staring at my house. She didn't move for hours. I can't tell if I've changed or if the world has. Maybe both. But I know one thing for certain. Whatever's out there, whatever's been creeping closer, it's coming for me. Let's start a new story. I first noticed something was off during lunch with my coworker, Mia. It was a mundane Tuesday, the kind that drags on so slowly you start counting ceiling tiles to stay sane. Mia and I had gone to a hole-in-the-wall taco place near the office. The kind with sticky tables and neon signs that buzz faintly. We were halfway through our food when she asked, "Didn't you say you grew up in Kansas?" I paused mid-bite. "No," I said. "Born and raised in Seattle. I've told you that like 3 times." She gave me a puzzled look, then laughed. "No, you told me Kansas. You even mentioned your dad used to run a farm out there." I blinked, trying to process what she'd just said. My dad was a retired software engineer. We barely kept a houseplant alive, let alone livestock. I started to correct her, but something about her expression made my stomach twist. It wasn't playful teasing. It was certainty, like she was recalling a fact she knew to be true. The rest of lunch passed awkwardly, with me pretending to laugh off the misunderstanding and Mia occasionally giving me side glances like I was the one acting weird. I brushed it off as a memory mix-up. Everyone misremembers things, right? But then it happened again, and again. By the end of the week, it wasn't just Mia. My manager congratulated me on my engagement, except I wasn't engaged. I'd been single for over a year. A barista at the coffee shop asked how my sister was doing, which might have been polite small talk, except I don't have a sister. My neighbor waved at me one morning and said, "Still driving that old red Camry, huh?" I didn't even own a car. At first, I thought it was some kind of elaborate prank. I even accused Mia of starting it, but the genuine confusion on her face made me feel stupid. "Why would I make that up?" she'd said, and I didn't have an answer. Then the stranger showed up. It was Saturday, and I was walking back to my apartment with a bag of groceries when I spotted him across the street. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd see in a black and white film, gray vest, pocket watch, polished shoes. What stood out most was his hat, a wide-brimmed fedora that cast his face in shadow, even though it was a bright, sunny afternoon. He was just standing there, facing me, but not moving. No phone in hand, no earphones, no signs of impatience, just still like he was waiting for something. I felt a chill creep up my spine and quicken my pace. When I glanced back, he was gone. I told myself I was imagining things, but I couldn't shake the unease. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I replayed the moment over and over in my mind. I hadn't imagined him. He'd been there, I was sure of it. Over the next week, things escalated. More people started remembering things about me that weren't true. My boss emailed me a project I supposedly worked on 6 months ago, a project I had no memory of with my name signed all over it. My landlord called to ask when I was moving out, claiming I'd given him notice weeks ago. And every so often, out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of the man in the hat. Always at a distance, always watching. It wasn't just people either. My belongings started to betray me. I opened my laptop one morning to find folders filled with photos of people I didn't recognize. Smiling group shots, selfies, even candid moments. Me at a wedding, me at a park, me with a dog I didn't own. My apartment keys stopped fitting in my door. I came home one night to find a stack of mail addressed to someone named Nathaniel Price. My name is Sam. I thought I was losing my mind. I even went to see a doctor who smiled sympathetically and handed me a pamphlet for stress management techniques. When I tried to explain about the man in the hat, she gave me that careful, clinical look reserved for patients teetering on the edge of delusion. The turning point came one night when I couldn't sleep. I'd been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a faint knock. It wasn't at the door, it came from inside the apartment. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. The knock came again, louder this time. It was coming from the closet. Every instinct screamed at me not to move, but my body acted on autopilot. I grabbed a lamp from the bedside table and crept toward the closet. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle and yanked the door open. Nothing, just coats and shoes. I stood there, staring, when I felt it a faint pressure like someone was breathing down my neck. I spun around, swinging the lamp wildly, but the room was empty. Except for him. The man in the hat was standing in the corner, motionless. His face was still obscured by shadow, but this time, I could see his mouth. He was smiling. I stumbled back, tripping over the bed frame. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if studying me. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, holding it out for me to take. My hands were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped it. The paper was blank, except for a single word scrawled in neat, precise handwriting. Remember. When I looked up again, he was gone. That word haunted me. What was I supposed to remember? I started searching for answers, digging through old photo albums, diaries, anything that might give me a clue. The more I searched, the more I realized how little of my life felt real. Memories blurred at the edges. Timelines didn't add up, and certain moments felt suspiciously pristine, like they'd been planted in my mind wholesale. And then there was the door. I found it 3 days later, tucked behind a bookshelf I'd had for years. I only noticed it because I dropped the pen, and when I bent down to retrieve it, I saw the faint outline of a frame in the wall. My heart raced as I shoved the bookshelf aside, revealing a narrow, wooden door I was certain hadn't been there before. It had no knob, just a keyhole. I knew, somehow, that I had to open it. But the key, I didn't have a key. Or maybe I did. Maybe I'd forgotten. I don't know what's on the other side of that door. It's still there, waiting for me. Sometimes when I walk past it, I hear faint whispers, too faint to make out, but insistent. The man in the hat hasn't appeared since, but I feel him everywhere. Watching, waiting, and the word on that piece of paper echoes in my mind every time I close my eyes. Remember. Let's start a new story. It happened on the kind of night that feels alive, the air humming with electricity like something is waiting to happen. I was driving home from a late shift at work. My mind fogged from exhaustion and the familiar monotony of the empty stretch of highway. It was a rural route, the kind where gas stations close early, and the only light comes from the occasional porch bulb or flicker of passing headlights. The radio barely worked that far out, so I let it play static just to keep me company. Somewhere between the hypnotic rhythm of my tires on asphalt and the sharp twist of an upcoming bend, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. Headlights, dim and distant, but they weren't there a moment ago. I didn't think much of it. There were plenty of late-night drivers, truckers, or people like me headed home. But as the road stretched on, the headlights got closer. Not unusual. What was unusual was how quickly they closed the distance. Within minutes, the car was on my tail, its high beams cutting through my mirrors like a knife. I squinted, gripping the wheel tighter as I muttered to myself, "What's your deal?" I tapped my brakes lightly, a subtle signal to back off. The other driver didn't. If anything, they moved closer, their lights burning into my vision. My heart picked up speed, and I eased off the gas, letting them pass if they were in such a hurry. Except they didn't pass. They just stayed there inches from my bumper, their headlights practically inside my car. I took a deep breath, telling myself not to panic. Maybe they were drunk or distracted, and the moment would pass. The road ahead forked, splitting into two routes, mine leading further into the countryside, the other veering toward the interstate. Relief washed over me. They'd likely take the highway, and I'd be rid of them. But when I took my turn, so did they. Now, my exhaustion was gone, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. The car didn't speed up or fall back, just kept pace with me like a shadow. The longer they stayed behind me, the more it felt deliberate. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard, 12:37 a.m. The stretch of road ahead was a straight shot, nothing but darkness for miles. I tried shaking them by speeding up, then slowing down, but they mirrored every move I made. That's when the first chill crawled up my spine. I thought about pulling over, letting them pass. But that idea turned sour almost as soon as it entered my head. What if they didn't pass? What if they stopped too? The thought of being stranded on an empty road with a stranger was worse than enduring their tailgating. So I kept driving. The static on the radio fizzled, and I instinctively reached for the dial. My eyes flicked to the mirror, and that's when I saw it. The silhouette of someone in the driver's seat, their outline visible against the blinding light. They weren't looking at the road. They were looking at me. My chest tightened. I jerked my eyes back to the road, my palms slick against the wheel. My mind raced. What do you do in situations like this? Call the cops? My phone was in the cup holder. But what would I even say? That someone was driving too close? That I had a bad feeling? I glanced at it anyway, debating, but when I looked back up, the car behind me swerved violently. For a second, I thought they were losing control. Their tires screeched as they zigzagged across the narrow two-lane road, then straightened out as if nothing had happened. But it wasn't an accident. It was intentional. They were messing with me. I pressed the gas harder, my engine groaning in protest as I pushed it past its usual limits. The car behind me didn't hesitate, matching my speed effortlessly. My pulse roared in my ears, louder than the static on the radio. The road curved sharply ahead, and for a moment, I thought I might lose control. My tires skidded, gravel kicking up against the undercarriage as I barely made the turn. The other car followed, steady as a predator. Then, their lights disappeared. It happened so quickly I almost didn't register it. 1 second, they were right behind me, their high beams carving through the night. The next, the road was dark again. I risked a glance in the mirror, half expecting to see them hanging back, but there was nothing. Just the void of an empty highway. Relief crashed over me like a wave, followed swiftly by confusion. Where did they go? The answer came too soon. As I rounded another bend, I saw them ahead of me now. Their car was parked diagonally across both lanes, blocking the road. The driver's door hung open, swinging slightly in the wind. My stomach plummeted. I slammed on the brakes, my car screeching to a halt as adrenaline surged through me. The driver stepped into the beam of my headlights. They were tall, their face obscured by a hood, their posture unnervingly calm. They stood there, staring at me, or at least I think they were staring. I couldn't see their eyes, but I felt the weight of their gaze like a physical thing. My hands trembled on the wheel as I struggled to decide what to do. If I stayed, I was a sitting duck. If I turned around, I'd lose time. And what if they followed? The figure took a step forward. That was all it took. I slammed the car into reverse, my tires squealing as I spun the wheel hard. Gravel sprayed again as I maneuvered back toward the fork in the road. My headlights caught a glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror, the figure breaking into a sprint, heading straight for me. They were fast, too fast. I didn't look back again. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of a gas station off the interstate, my knuckles white from gripping the wheel. The clerk gave me a strange look when I stumbled inside, muttering something about a weird guy and a blocked road, but I didn't stick around to explain. I just needed to be somewhere bright, somewhere with other people. I never took that road again. I heard rumors later, stories about strange encounters and cars running drivers off the highway in that area. But no one ever caught the person responsible. Maybe it was a prank, someone with a sick sense of humor. Or maybe it was something worse. Even now, when I drive alone at night, I check the rearview mirror compulsively. Because whoever they were, they're still out there. Let's start a new story. It had the subtle wrongness of a skipped step. My alarm buzzed at 6:30 a.m., and I rolled out of bed with a groggy sigh. Everything in my apartment seemed just as I'd left it. The half-empty coffee mug from last night sat on the counter, my sneakers were by the door, and my phone was charging on the nightstand. Routine, comforting. On my way to work, I took my usual route, a straight shot down Bellamy Street, past the bakery that always smelled like cinnamon, the dry cleaner with its tacky neon sign, and the corner newsstand where the owner, Jerry, greeted me with a familiar nod. I waved back as usual and kept walking. But then, just before I reached the bus stop, something made me stop. It was Jerry. Again. He was leaning against the same newsstand I'd just passed, nodding in the exact same way. His expression, his posture, it was identical, like a photograph brought to life twice in a row. My skin prickled, but I brushed it off. Maybe he'd walked around the block. Maybe I'd missed him doubling back somehow. I didn't stop to ask. The bus was coming, and I wasn't about to be late for work over some bizarre coincidence. Work was uneventful. Spreadsheets, emails, and small talk that felt increasingly hollow. At lunch, I ventured to the deli across the street. As I waited in line, a man in a green jacket caught my eye. He was sitting by the window, a sandwich in hand, staring blankly out at the street. Something about him felt familiar, but I couldn't place why. On my way back to the office, I passed the same man again. This time, he was sitting on a bench outside my building. Same green jacket, same sandwich, same blank expression. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting him to look up or call out to me, but he just sat there, frozen in a moment I couldn't understand. By the time I got home, I convinced myself that I was imagining things. Stress, maybe. A lack of sleep. I tossed my keys onto the coffee table and went to the kitchen to pour a drink. That's when I noticed the mug. The same mug I'd left on the counter this morning, still half full with coffee, its rim stained with last night's lipstick. I frowned. I distinctly remembered rinsing it out before heading to bed. I grabbed the mug and turned it over in my hands, inspecting it as if it might offer some clue. But it was just a mug, ordinary, unassuming, except for the fact that it shouldn't have been there. That night, the dream started. Vivid, disjointed fragments of places I didn't recognize, but felt I'd been to 1,000 times. Streets stretched into infinite loops, people moved in jerky, repetitive motions, and every time I tried to walk away, I'd find myself back where I started. In one dream, I stood in front of a mirror, but my reflection didn't match my movements. It stood still, watching, its eyes unblinking. When I woke up, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. My apartment felt foreign, like I was seeing it through someone else's eyes. I noticed details I'd never paid attention to before. Scratches on the coffee table that formed a near-perfect circle, a small dent in the fridge door that looked suspiciously like a fingerprint, and a strand of hair on my pillow that was much longer than mine. It was as if the world had been rearranged while I wasn't looking, just enough to be off-kilter, but not enough to scream for attention. The following day, I tried to break my routine. I took a different route to work, avoiding Bellamy Street altogether. It didn't help. I saw the same red-haired woman in a floral dress at every corner, clutching a shopping bag that never seemed to change weight. At the deli, the man in the green jacket was waiting outside before I even ordered my lunch. By the time I got back to my desk, I was shaking. The tipping point came that evening when I went out for groceries. The parking lot of the store was nearly empty, but as I walked toward the entrance, I saw my car parked in a far corner. It was unmistakable, same license plate, same scratch on the rear bumper. My heart pounded. I'd left my car at home, hadn't I? I turned on my heel and hurried back. My car was still in my driveway, parked exactly as I'd left it. That's when I noticed the lights in my apartment were on. Every window glowed a warm yellow, though I hadn't left anything on when I went out. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring up at the building. My shadow stretched in front of me, but something was wrong. My shadow wasn't alone. Another figure's shadow stood beside mine, taller, bulkier, and when I turned around, no one was there. I didn't go inside that night. I stayed at a motel instead, leaving the lights on and the TV playing quietly to drown out the eerie silence. The next morning, I returned home cautiously. Everything was just as I'd left it, or so I thought. On the coffee table, my keys sat next to the mug, perfectly placed as though someone had arranged them. On the mug's rim, fresh lipstick smudges glinted in the morning light, bright red, a shade I'd never owned. I began to test the boundaries of whatever was happening. I left cryptic notes in random places. "Who are you?" on a sticky note under the couch. "Stop this" scribbled on the back of a cereal box. The notes always disappeared without explanation. I tried filming myself while I slept, but every recording showed me tossing and turning for hours, only to freeze for long stretches as though the footage had been spliced. The world outside grew worse. Patterns began folding in on themselves. The same dog barked at the same man on the same corner every morning, their actions so precise they could have been choreographed. Streetlights flickered in perfect unison. Conversations sounded rehearsed, like the people around me were actors stumbling through poorly written lines. One evening, I tried to leave. I got in my car and drove until the city faded into empty highways, but no matter which exit I took, I always ended up back on Bellamy Street. By the third loop, I pulled over, shaking, and screamed at the top of my lungs. The sound seemed to vanish into the air, absorbed by a world that wasn't real. Now, I'm not sure what's left to fight. The patterns have tightened their grip, and I've started to see myself, versions of me, watching from the corners of my vision. A reflection in a shop window, a passenger in a passing car, or the shadow that doesn't move when I do. I don't know if I'm being studied, controlled, or slowly replaced. But the scariest thought? Maybe this was how it's always been. Maybe I'm just waking up to a truth that was there all along. Let's start a new story. The first time I saw the old green bicycle, it was propped against a lamppost at the end of our street. Its frame was scuffed and rusted in places, with a chain that sagged like it had given up years ago. No one in our neighborhood owned it. I was sure of that. We were a tight-knit community where even a lost cat was everyone's business. But the bike? It just appeared one day, as if it had always been there, and no one claimed it. I didn't pay it much attention at first. It was just a bike after all. My teenage brain was far more consumed with school, video games, and the ever-growing pile of laundry my mom nagged me about daily. But the bike didn't go away. Days passed, then weeks, and no one moved it. It wasn't chained to the post, yet it never tipped over, even on the windiest days. People began to notice. Mr. Harris, the old man who walked his dog every morning, swore he saw someone riding it one night, but he couldn't describe the rider, just muttering something about a blur. Kids in the neighborhood avoided it, whispering about curses and haunted objects. I laughed it off until the night I came face to face with it. It was late, probably close to midnight. I'd been at a friend's house binge-watching some horror series, and my walk home felt unusually quiet. The streets, usually filled with the sounds of crickets and distant cars, were eerily still. As I rounded the corner to my street, I saw it. The bike. But this time, it wasn't propped against the lamppost. It was standing upright in the middle of the road, perfectly balanced. No kickstand, no wind, just defying gravity. My heart gave a little leap, and I stopped in my tracks, staring at it. I told myself it was just some neighborhood prank. Maybe the McAllister twins, notorious for their late-night antics, were hiding somewhere, watching me. Very funny, I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. My voice echoed down the empty street. No one answered. I took a cautious step forward. The bike didn't move. Another step, then another. When I was about 10 feet away, the air changed. It wasn't a sound or a smell, but an electric hum, like the kind you feel during a lightning storm. My skin prickled. I glanced around, half expecting someone to jump out from behind a bush, but the street was deserted. All right, I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. Just a stupid bike. I reached out, intending to push it over, to prove it wasn't some supernatural oddity. My fingers brushed the handlebars, and that's when I heard it, a faint, metallic laugh. The kind that doesn't belong to a person, but to something older, colder. My hand jerked back as if I'd touched a live wire. The bike tipped slightly, then steadied itself, still standing. I did the only thing my panicked brain could think of. I ran. My feet pounded against the pavement, the sound echoing in the dead silence. I didn't look back until I reached my driveway, panting and shaking. The bike was gone. I swore it had followed me, but the street was empty. My house loomed dark and quiet, the porch light casting long shadows that felt suddenly sinister. I darted inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I convinced myself it was a dream. Stress, maybe, or too many horror shows. But when I left for school, the bike was back. Not by the lamppost this time, but leaning against our mailbox. My heart sank. I walked past it quickly, pretending not to notice, though I felt its presence like a pair of eyes boring into the back of my neck. Over the next few days, the bike became persistent. It appeared everywhere I went. Outside the school gates, near the park, even outside the diner where my friends and I hung out. No one else seemed to notice it, or if they did, they didn't say anything. It was like the bike was following me, waiting for something. One night, curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. I decided to confront it. Armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat, I waited until everyone in my house was asleep. Then I slipped outside, heart pounding in my chest. The bike was there, as I knew it would be, waiting under the streetlight like a predator in plain sight. "This ends tonight," I whispered, gripping the bat tightly. The bike didn't move. I stepped closer, half expecting it to lunge at me, or sprout legs, or I don't know something, but it just sat there. I swung the bat, hard, aiming for the front wheel. The bat connected with a dull thud, and the bike toppled over. For a moment, I felt victorious. Stupid bike, I thought. But then the air changed again, that same electric hum from before. The bike began to rattle. Slowly, impossibly, it rose back onto its wheels. My flashlight flickered, then died, plunging the street into darkness. Panic surged through me as the bike began to move, rolling forward with no rider, its wheels spinning silently. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the house, only that I slammed the door shut behind me, my chest heaving. But the nightmare didn't end there. Over the next few nights, the bike became more aggressive. Scratches appeared on the front door. Shadows flickered in my room when no one was there. And always, that faint metallic laughter in the distance. Desperation drove me to research. I scoured old newspapers, library archives, anything that might explain the cursed bicycle. What I found chilled me to the bone. Decades ago, a boy had been hit by a car while riding a green bike. The accident happened at the same intersection where the bike first appeared. Witnesses claimed the driver fled the scene, leaving the boy to die alone. His family moved away, and the case was never solved. The bike, they said, vanished after the accident. I don't know why it chose me. Maybe I reminded it of the driver. Maybe it just needed someone to see it. All I know is that one night, after weeks of torment, I woke to find the bike at the foot of my bed, its frame gleaming in the moonlight. The laughter was louder now, filling the room. I don't remember screaming, but I must have. My parents found me curled up in the corner, the bike gone. We moved a month later. I've never told anyone the full story, afraid they'd think I'd lost my mind. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that laughter again, faint and metallic, like a ghost in the wind. And I know, deep down, that it's still out there, waiting for someone else to find it.